What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto had a sister but tragedy turned him into a monster? If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. And also check the description to original creator of this beautiful creation. It was a dreary and cloudy day. Throughout the village, there was an unspoken sadness that lingered about, through every place, person, and thing. Normally, a person walking through the village would be able to see children playing with one another. However, the normally bustling metropolis was more akin to a ghost town. Hiruzen Sarutobi was situated in his office, having been forced to retake his position after the tragic death of his successor. However, while he enjoyed his retirement, having to retake his former position was not the reason for his sorrow. When looking upon the two children sleeping in a crib in his office, the veteran Cage sighed. What am I to do with them? He thought. He wished that he could give them a normal life, however, that was highly unlikely. The seal placed upon the belly of the younger female twin was proof enough of that. In the midst of his thoughts, he heard a knocking on his office door. Enter, he said. Upon seeing the visitor enter his office he was overcome with a sense of annoyance that nearly was able to overpower his previous melancholy. To what do I owe this pleasure, Danzo? He asked, in a voice that obviously lacked any sincerity. Before speaking, Danzo slowly and methodically approached the desk of the Hokage and took a seat. I have come to discuss a critical issue, he said, after having sat down. An issue pertaining to the safety and prosperity of the village. While Hiruzen could not refute Danzo's usefulness when it came to protecting Konoha from the shadows, it did not lessen the irritation he felt when being forced to converse with him. What is it? He asked with a little bit of trepidation. A small part of him already had a good idea as to why he was visiting. I have come to discuss the actions that should be taken in regards to the fate of these two infants, Danzo said while peering over towards the crib containing the two children. There was not a look of disdain or hatred on his face. Rather, it was more of a look of immense intrigue. If your wish is for them to be put into your root program, then you are wasting your time here. Snapped the god of shinobi. Have you no respect for the wishes of my successor? He wished for them to live pleasant lives. Is living such a life possible in this world of ours? Danzo asked. This world is in an endless cycle of war and bloodshed. The moment Lord first distributed the Biju amongst the 5 villages he sparked an arms race that has persisted for decades after his passing. Hiruzen had trouble refuting the statement of his old friend. However, it did not shake his stance on the subject in the slightest. He could not fail these children. Upon seeing the two children for the first time he felt as though he was intruding upon perfection. The girl, who possessed flawless, almost porcelain-like skin, would likely grow up to look very similar to her mother. When looking upon her, however, his eyes did not miss the 4 symbols seal placed upon her abdomen. However, shockingly, it was the boy who managed to keep his gaze the longest. His skin was slightly paler than his sister's, but in no way was it less beautiful. His blonde hair was a shade lighter than his father's, but it was rather obvious that he would grow up to look very similar to the 4th Hokage. However, it was his eyes that fascinated him the most. They glowed like bright diamonds in the night sky and gave off a feeling of omniscience that should not belong to a child so young. Danzo, he sighed, while your pessimistic view of the world may have some truth to it, I must keep the promise I made to their parents. The only way for this world to progress into an era of peace is for individuals such as ourselves to break the cycle of war. How can we expect to do such a thing when we are in the process of creating child soldiers? Danzo's expression did not change in the slightest, but his mind was working a mile a minute. While he has never been able to rival Sarutobi in terms of power, he was more than able to match or even surpass him intellectually. While he wouldn't consider himself vastly superior to Sarutobi in terms of intelligence, he is willing to do things that his rival isn't, and that gives him an edge. Very well, Hiruzen, he said. Eventually, you will see things my way. Danzo was a patient man, and it wouldn't be in his best interest to rile Hiruzen up. He would need to play his cards correctly while also making sure to keep them close to his chest. He would have what he wanted. 6 years later, Mito found herself running through the village, her face a picture of glee. She always enjoyed peaceful and sunny days such as these. The matron of the orphanage would always allow the children to play in the village every Friday. It was an especially beautiful day today. The streets were packed with people completing their daily tasks. As she was running, several citizens gave her polite smiles and nodded to her. Her kind and excitable nature was infectious and allowed her to make friends easily. Finally, she arrived at her destination. A playground teeming with children, all enjoying themselves and playing to their heart's content. She recognized many of the children there, including her two friends Ino Yamanaka and Sakura Haruno playing in the sandbox. While approaching the sandbox, she halted in her tracks. She couldn't believe it. How could she have forgotten? Big brother, she yelled in a panic. She couldn't believe that she had forgotten to make sure they didn't lose each other in the crowd. Her brother was her rock. He was always there to look out for her and frequently put her needs before that of his own. She was so reliant on his presence that it was almost always unpleasant for her to be separated from him. She jolted upon hearing a familiar voice behind her. "I am here, Mito, there is no need to worry." She turned around and saw the subject of her thoughts. Naruto was the same as ever, a perfect picture of calmness. She often wondered how he was so mature. It was almost as if he was smarter than most of the adults in the village. She was no slouch in the intellect department herself, but her brother always seemed to be a level above her in almost everything. "Big bro, what do you want to play today?" she asked with excitement. However, she knew it was a silly question to ask, as she knew exactly what his response would be. "I'd enjoy doing whatever you want to do," he answered with a polite smile. She sighed in frustration. Her brother was oftentimes selfless to a fault. She often felt guilty when they played together. Just for once, she'd like to do whatever he wanted to do. It was like he existed just to make her life easier, and it made her feel useless in comparison. She could not recall an instance in which she was able to help her brother the way that he constantly helped her. "You're always like this," she groaned. "Why is it that you never want to decide what we play?" "I'm happy when you're happy," he said. "You always choose the best games anyway." Contrary to what his sister believed, Naruto was arguably more reliant on her than she was on him. He was not as skilled when it came to socializing with others, which is why his sister was his only friend. "Fine," she snapped. "I'll go play with Sakura and Ino then. Would that make you happy?" She knew that she was being immature, but that was to be expected from someone so young. "Of course," he responded politely, much to her indignation. In truth, she was hoping that her ultimatum would have resulted in him being forced to finally decide on what they did. However, she was too stubborn to turn back now, so she ran off to play with her two friends. Naruto smiled while watching his sister run towards her friends. Once she left his sight, however, his smile vanished and left what could only be described as an emotionless expression. He wasn't sure why, but he had trouble expressing and understanding his emotions. Not that he couldn't feel them, it was just that he struggled understanding and expressing them correctly. He had no idea why he was like this. Was he born this way, or had some horribly unspeakable event affected his psyche? He wouldn't be surprised if the latter was the case. He knew that much of the growing up period for a child was a blur. However, he felt like he was remembering less and less with every day that went by. It had gotten to the point where he couldn't even remember what he enjoyed to do. Had he perhaps once enjoyed playing outside with other children? He honestly felt like he'd never know. Danzo had been observing the two children for quite some time. While most would consider it odd for a man of his age to constantly watch over two 6-year-olds, he cared little for their opinions. What he was doing was in his mind, for the betterment of the village. The young boy, Naruto, as he was called, fascinated him more than he thought any person would be able to. The look in the boy's eyes was something special, something that even his most elite root Anbu were unable to obtain, even through the most ruthless of training. Furthermore, he possessed an impressive level head, even at such a young age. He hadn't seen such an intelligent child since Itachi Uchiha, a young boy who has risen to become one of Konoha's most valuable assets. He decided that today would be the day that he would approach the boy. His sister had just gone on to her own devices and he doubted he'd find a better opportunity. He slowly made his way towards the blonde who was silently observing the activities of the playground. He brought himself to the boy's side and they stood in silence for what felt like minutes. "Can I help you, sir?" Naruto eventually asked in his ever-pleasant tone. Danzo noticed that the look that he admired so much had all but disappeared from the child's face. This only fascinated him even more. The child was seemingly able to change his expression at the drop of a hat, a valuable skill indeed. "Do you care for her?" he asked the boy. The young child looked into Danzo's lone eye with an intensity that could hardly be described with words. He eventually turned his gaze towards his sister and nodded. "You're aware that she is different?" Danzo continued. "In the future people will covet her. Much like the attempted kidnapping of the Hyuga heir earlier this year, they will come for her. What will you do if that happens?" Naruto didn't respond to his question, but Danzo already knew what his answer would be. The boy would likely stop at nothing to keep her safe. If Danzo was able to extend that protectiveness and loyalty towards the village as well, the child would become an immeasurably valuable asset. "I can give you the ability to protect her," he said. "However, the Hokage does not wish for you to become as powerful as you need to be." The Hokage had always been an active presence in the twins' lives. Some may call it favoritism, but he was the Hokage, so they held their tongues. Typically, someone of Naruto's obvious talent would have been entered into the academy by now, but Hiruzen wouldn't allow it. This frustrated Danzo to no end, but he had a plan that would soon take effect. "We shall meet again soon," Danzo said before turning and leaving the area. Naruto continued watching his sister without any notable change in his demeanor, minus the intense blue glowing of his eyes. Mito was in the process of helping Ino build a sandcastle. However, every few seconds she would look over her shoulder to see what her brother was doing. He was just standing there, being his perfectly socially awkward self. She was rather perceptive for her age. If not for the obvious genius of her brother overshadowing her, she'd probably be regarded as one of those child prodigies. It was through this perceptiveness that she had been able to notice several things about her brother. First, while she loved him to death, he was very strange at times. When they were even younger, the matron would tell him to go and play, and he would simply ask why. It was almost as if he didn't know how to enjoy himself. Secondly, he treated her as if she was God's gift to this earth. If he was ever given a snack, he wouldn't eat it until he had at least offered it to her first. It had gotten to the point that if she didn't refuse, he'd likely starve. Not to say his caring treatment wasn't pleasant most of the time. No matter what happened throughout her day, she knew her brother would support her no matter what. And finally, there was his bizarre trust issues. He didn't seem to trust anyone other than her, not even Old Man Hokage. She was unsure why he was that way, but frankly, there were a lot of things she didn't know. Much of her early life had been a blur to her. Her psyche was an amalgamation of many strange memories, most of which she wasn't even able to recall. "Mito, you aren't even paying attention. And look, you're messing up Castle Yamanaka," a voice next to her groaned. She looked down towards the sand castle she had been making, and was surprised to see that her knee was pressing into the walls. Had she really lost focus during playtime? That was so unlike her. "Sorry, Ino," she said. "I just have a lot on my mind, I guess." "Does it have anything to do with your cute brother?" Ino asked, using a voice that she reserved for irritating people. "You know, I wish you'd tell him about me." "Shut it, Ino," Mito snapped. "My big bro is off limits. Besides, he probably wouldn't even be able to tell that you had a crush on him." She felt like she had this conversation with Ino every time they'd meet. "Ino, why don't you give Mito a break?" asked the pink-haired girl sitting on the other side of the castle of sand. "But Sakurai," Ino began to say, but she was interrupted. She turned her head and saw the subject of their conversation standing just outside the confines of the sandbox. "What is it that you are up to, Mito?" Naruto asked, seemingly ignoring the other two girls entirely. "Big bro," Mito exclaimed. "I was helping Ino and Sakura build a sandcastle, but Ino was being annoying again." "Is that so?" Naruto asked. "That wouldn't do." He glanced over at the other two young girls. Both were looking a little skittish, and were attempting to avoid his gaze. That was also something he'd noticed. People seemed to be very uncomfortable making eye contact with him. He didn't consider himself an intimidating person, so why was it that even some adults wavered under his gaze? However, that was a thought for another time. He bent down towards his sister and extended his hand, telling her that the matron was calling them home. The little redhead crossed her arms and pouted, clearly not wanting to leave. However, eventually she relented and they began walking back to the orphanage together. Standing next to his sister gave him an overwhelming sense of clarity. So long as they were together, everything would be fine. In his private residence, Danzo was currently conversing with a seemingly normal middle-aged couple. The male was of average height and build with curly brown hair and brown eyes. The woman was equally average with orange hair and green eyes. "You have been chosen for an important mission," he said. I have been told that the two of you hold a stellar reputation within the community. Is this true? Yes, Danzo-sama, they simultaneously responded. I have been in conversation with several influential members of the daimyo's court. They have convinced him to pressure the Hokage to allow Mito and Naruto Uzumaki to be adopted into a family. In doing so, you will gain custody of the children and be able to make decisions on their behalf. The couple didn't respond. However, they nodded their heads in understanding. The leader of Root's plan was beginning to make sense to them. You wish for us to gain custody of the children so we can allow them to be tutored in the ninja arts? The man asked. Danzo nodded. It wasn't a complicated plan, so he was not surprised that the man was able to figure it out. Danzo knew that Hiruzen would know that he was responsible for getting the daimyo involved. However, there wasn't much the Hokage could do when a request was made to him by the daimyo of Fire Country himself. Regardless, Hiruzen will never allow the boy to be entered into Root, Danzo said. However, allowing them to be tutored is within the realm of possibility. You are dismissed. I expect you to have gained custody within the week. The couple stood and bowed before being escorted from the home by two Root Anbu. Now that he was left to himself, he was able to think back on the means in which he made this possible. He had done several favors for the members of the daimyo's court. However, what really brought the nobles on board was when they were allowed to see the two children. Being very rich and superficial, they were enamored with the beauty of the twins. Finally, when informed of the vast potential the two children possessed, they were sold. The possibility of perhaps having a future Hokage in their pocket was very appealing. Danzo was disgusted by those of noble birth. Born into power and yet oftentimes never doing anything of value with it. However, despite his disgust, he knew that he needed the support of such people in order to make progress. That boy, Naruto Uzumaki, he knew better than to think the child would be a simple pawn. The boy was destined to be a leader of men, someone who would be able to do things that he and normal people could only dream of. The time for patience was ending and the moment for action had arrived. Naruto was walking adjacent to the Naka River. It was one of those rare moments in which he and his sister were not close to one another. She was currently asleep at the orphanage, so this was his only opportunity for private thoughts. He often pondered things that children his age shouldn't even be capable of comprehending. Why was he so different from everyone else? He knew that he was a special child. The only person that he believed to be more special than himself was Mito. He could sense the dormant power within her. But that wasn't what intrigued him. No, the source of his intrigue was the fact that she was the only person he felt a connection towards. It was difficult to explain, but she was the only person on this earth whose life held any value to him. Hello, a voice said, interrupting his thoughts. He turned and saw a young man with onyx eyes under which were long, pronounced tear troughs. He had jet black hair that was pulled back in a low ponytail and his face was framed with center-parted bangs that extended to his chin. It was obvious that he was an Uchiha. Itachi was unsure why he had approached the child. Perhaps it was because he was able to notice the obvious similarities between the two of them. Or perhaps it was because he noticed the subtle differences. You are in Uchiha territory, he said. It is uncommon for outsiders such as yourself to visit this place. Outsider? Naruto asked, in a voice laced with curiosity. Are we not all fellow citizens of Konoha? Of course, Itachi responded. I was not disputing your right to be here. I was merely acknowledging the rarity of such a visit. Itachi was getting a strange feeling from this child. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like he would need to choose his words wisely. Upon further inspection of the river, Naruto was able to see an insect floating down on a small twig. He couldn't help but see himself in the helpless creature. Much like that bug, he was adrift on a path in which he had almost no control. Someone or something could easily help the insect and take it off the path that would surely lead to its demise. However, a bird swooping from the sky and scooping it into its beak, clearly with the goal of consumption, seemed more likely. While watching the blonde child who was clearly lost in thought, Itachi recalled his younger days. Days in which he pondered the meaning of life, death, and what a shinobi was. Much like him, this child would eventually come to his own conclusions. I am aware of who you are. I am also aware of who your sister is, Itachi stated. Itachi noticed that at the mentioning of his sister Naruto seemed much more focused on looking intensely into his eyes. Itachi felt the subconscious need to activate his Sharingan. He was unsure why, but he felt as though Naruto's gaze was dangerous and should be avoided if possible. I was hoping that my little brother would become friends with someone like your sister, Itachi said, attempting to ease the conversation into a more pleasant one. He often focuses too much training and too little on enjoying himself. That is the burden of prodigies, is it not? Naruto asked, finally looking away from Itachi's eyes. Yes, Itachi responded, a little surprised at how much he has spoken with this child. I am sure that is something you can understand as well. Naruto chuckled a little but didn't respond. Itachi was unaware if the laugh was real or fake, but it did not matter. His thoughts were returning to his original reason for coming here. Much like this child, he too had much on his mind. The current tensions between the Uchiha clan and the village were reaching dangerous levels. He had recently joined the Anbu and his father had ordered him to be an information pipeline between the Uchiha and the village. All in all, it made for a very stressful life. Out of nowhere, he felt a presence approaching from the trees behind him. Naruto showed no signs of noticing, but he had little doubt that the young boy was aware that they were being approached. "Hey, Itachi," a jubilant voice greeted. Upon hearing it, it was obvious that the voice belonged to his friend, Shisui. His relationship with Shisui was an odd one, to say the least. On one hand, Shisui was his only true friend. On the other, he was a sort of older brother figure that he had never had before. And finally, he was one of the people Itachi admired the most. Shisui was perhaps the only person in the clan who rivaled Itachi in sheer talent. However, he had little doubt that at the moment, Shisui was leagues above him in power. "Who's this little guy?" Shisui asked while crouching down to get at eye level with the smaller blonde child. Naruto glanced at him in his peripheral vision and then continued looking out towards the lake. "He is Naruto Uzumaki," Itachi answered. Naruto's sister, Mito, was very well known throughout the village. He was certain that had it been her here, Shisui would have recognized her instantly. However, Naruto was a very odd child now that he thought about it. He could either be a person you'd never forget or a person you'd never remember. He wondered if Naruto chose which of these two effects he had on people, or if he did so subconsciously. "Ah, look at the little guy," Shisui said. "It's like he's a little Itachi 2.0, is he as much of a nerd as you, Itachi?" Itachi was unamused by Shisui's comments but did not take them too seriously. He knew Shisui was simply attempting to get under his skin. "Are you Shisui the teleporter?" Naruto asked, surprising the two Uchiha with his sudden question. "Why yes I am," Shisui said, before turning to Itachi. "As you can see, Itachi, this is what it is like when you are a famous shinobi. It's better for you to learn how to deal with your fans now rather than later." Itachi was unaware as to whether or not Shisui was joking or being serious, but with him, you could never tell. "Would you like an autograph, little guy?" Shisui asked with a charismatic smile on his face while turning towards the boy. His expression only turned to surprise when he noticed the young child walking in the other direction, likely heading home. "Quite the loyal fanbase you have there," quipped Itachi. For once, actually being the one to poke fun. "Shut up," Shisui mumbled under his breath. It was obvious that he would be pouting for the next few minutes. Sasuke was within the Uchiha training grounds, even at such a late hour. To him, training was more important than anything. He wanted to surpass his brother more than anything in the world. While most would assume this goal stemmed from a desire to steal his brother's spotlight, it was actually much more innocent in its origin. He simply wanted to be able to stand next to his brother rather than behind him. He threw another handful of shuriken at the wooden training post. They all hit their mark, but the accuracy was slightly less than perfect. Sasuke furrowed his brows in frustration upon seeing this. All he ever heard about was how much of a prodigy his brother was. He was certain when Itachi was his age his shuriken jutsu was much better than his was at the moment. The thought made him clench his teeth. Not to mention he had yet to even learn the fire style, fireball jutsu, which was considered a rite of passage within the clan. Suddenly, he felt an unwelcome presence behind him and turned around instantly. Standing not too far behind him was a young blonde boy, who was likely the same age as him. "You're quite good," the boy said with a polite smile on his face. "Who are you?" Sasuke demanded. He would never consider himself to be an impolite person, but this boy had appeared unwelcome, and on private property no less. "Why are you training so hard?" the boy asked, avoiding his question altogether. Though, there seemed to be genuine curiosity behind his inquiry. I'm training because I have a goal that I need to reach, Sasuke responded. He didn't feel comfortable explaining the details of his dream to someone that he had never met before in his life. What will you do if you find that your goal is unattainable? Naruto asked. What if you have been wasting your time with this training? Who are you to ask that? Sasuke asked, a little irritated. You've never met me before and yet you feel as though you have the right to weigh in on the odds of my success. I am not saying that you will fail, Naruto said in a placating tone. However, is it not better to be prepared for the worst? If you are always prepared for the worst, you'll never be disappointed and you can only ever be pleasantly surprised. Sasuke furrowed his brow upon hearing the blonde's statement. Who was this kid? Was he not aware of how strange his intrusion was? Before he could respond, the strange boy started speaking again. I can feel it flowing off of you, he said. The immense desire to succeed and the equally immense fear of failure. Why exist to meet the standards of others? Why not exist simply for yourself? Sasuke made sure to respond before the blonde spoke again. Because I have faith, he said. I have faith that I will succeed and I have faith in my loved ones. Upon saying this, he immediately thought of Itachi. He knew that no matter what, his big brother would always love him. I see, Naruto said, with a serene smile. Well, I hope that those people never disappoint you, because then what would you have, other than yourself and a bunch of empty dreams? And before Sasuke could respond, he turned around and left the training ground. Sasuke was afraid. Not afraid of the boy, but afraid when weighing the validity of his words in his mind. Could he be right? Sasuke nervously thought. However, once again his thoughts drifted towards his big brother and he was at ease. The next morning Naruto was woken up from his slumber by an excited Mito. Big bro, she shouted as she shook his arm. Yes? He asked, slightly interested in what had made her so excited. A nice man and lady are here. They say that they want us to live with them, she exclaimed. This was the most excited he had ever seen his sister before. On the outside, he smiled softly at her happiness. However, his inner thoughts were a different story. Who were these people? And for what reason did they wish to adopt him and his sister? However, what bothered him most was that they were attempting to intrude upon their lives. To him, he'd prefer for he and Mito to live alone together for the remainder of their existence. He was dragged by his sister into the lobby and saw the nice couple standing there, speaking with the matron. She saw us and brought them over in order to make an introduction, but Naruto wasn't listening. These people felt very similar to that old man he'd met in the park. Were they his associates? And why did they wish to interfere with he and his sister's lives? The rest of the day was a blur that ended with Naruto and Mito being escorted by their new family to their home. 4 years later, Naruto sat upon the head of the fourth Hokage's stone face. Over the past 4 years, he has grown exponentially as a shinobi. Due to his natural talent and his private tutoring, he has risen to the highest rank in his academy class. In stark contrast to himself, his sister was ranked closer to the bottom. However, this was due to the fact that she had trouble controlling her chakra properly. Regardless, the potential for her to become powerful was always there. His 2 legal guardians had been model parents. However, he was able to see through their facade. Underneath their caring exterior, there was an obvious ulterior motive. The Hokage had seemed quite irritated when he and Mito were handed over to their new guardians. Whether this was because he truly cared for them or because he too had his own motives, he did not know. However, his instincts led him to believe that it was the latter of the 2 possibilities. In the midst of his thoughts, he heard very light footsteps and the tapping of a cane approaching him. Ah, Danzo-san. What can I do for you? He asked in a pleasant voice. Over the years he had occasionally been approached by the elderly man for what he considered to be very tedious conversation. The man foolishly thought that he could use his sister as leverage against him. If he were a normal person he would resent the man's feeble attempts, but he simply found them to be amusing. I see that you have once again skipped out of attending the academy, Danzo said, not once letting his stoic expression leave his face. Ah, it seems as though I've been caught, Naruto quipped with a charming smile. Whatever will I do? While your sarcasm is amusing, I have come to inform you of some tragic news, Danzo responded, in a voice that showed he hardly cared about the tragedy. The boy was incredibly difficult to deal with at times. It was impossible to get a read on him, even with his many years of experience. Had he been a lesser man, he would have been uncomfortable with approaching the child. "It seems as though your guardians have been killed," he said. "They lost their lives during a mission at the border of Earth Country." The boy's expression didn't change in the slightest. It was in stark contrast to how his sister had reacted to the news. She had almost immediately broken out into tears, having lost the first people who loved her like a daughter. Danzo continued when the boy didn't respond, "You and your sister will have to return to the orphanage. However, I regret to inform you that you will be going to separate facilities." He could see the boy looking at him from the corner of his eyes with his icy, yet serene stare. He often wondered how the boy's eyes could glow so unnaturally. It gave him an almost supernatural vibe. "You shall be put into the facility known as Orphanage 8, a place known for producing exceptional young men. You will also cease your attendance of the academy, and when you come of age you will be made a genin of this village," Danzo said, waiting to see what the boy's response would be. He was not used to being the one constantly on edge during a conversation. To think that a boy of 10 would be able to control a conversation without uttering a single word. "And what of Mito?" the boy asked, finally participating in the conversation. "She will return to Konoha Orphanage and will continue to attend the academy," replied Danzo. He knew that separating the two could have negative consequences. However, this was necessary, as he felt the girl was holding the boy back. Suddenly, two rude Anbu appeared at Naruto's sides and one placed their hand on his shoulder. "You will be escorted to the facility immediately. Your possessions have already been collected and your teachers have been notified of the reason for your future absence," Danzo said in a stern voice. Naruto was immediately brought to the front of the facility in a shunshin. Frankly, it did not look nearly as nice as Danzo had implied, but he never made a habit of trusting the words of others, so it didn't surprise him. Two men dressed in white lab coats and black shinobi pants and sandals were waiting for them in front of the building. One was in his 40s with slicked back black hair and equally black eyes. The other, who was obviously the one in charge, appeared to be a gentle-looking old man with a bald head and a white beard. "Hello, young man," greeted the elderly gentleman. "I am head supervisor Zaki Takejiro. It is a pleasure to meet you. I'm sure we will be getting to know each other very well over the next few years." Naruto ignored the introduction in favor of observing the imposing building before him. It looked more like a psychiatric hospital than an orphanage. It was surrounded by woods and didn't have a place for children to play. It was clear to him that this was not a normal orphanage, and he was amused upon realizing that this was another one of Danzo's ploys. As he was brought into the building, he noticed that it looked like something akin to a juvenile facility. The place was lacking in hospitality, and as he walked throughout the halls he noticed that the glares of the other children followed him. He thought with amusement. It seems as though friends will be few and far between here. Over the past 4 years, he had come to realize that people were never truly what they seemed to be. He was special, as he was able to see a person's true nature. More often than not, he noticed a darkness within every person. The only exception to this was his sister, but she was different from everyone else in his eyes, so it was unsurprising. His thoughts were interrupted when he was brought into a dark room with a single chair in the center. The chair had many straps attached to it, clearly for the purpose restraining the occupant. Next to the chair was an IV stand that was no doubt intended for him. "While I know that this may not be the most pleasant introduction to my facility, I hope that you can understand the necessity of it," Supervisor Takejiro said in a polite voice. "This concoction will allow us to get some much-needed honest answers from you. I've heard that can be quite the evasive conversationist." Naruto was immediately placed in the chair and strapped in tightly. He looked over at the IV being stuck into his right arm with a calm curiosity. However, his attention was brought in front of him when Takejiro placed his hand on his shoulder. "Now, let's see what secrets you hold," he said in a somewhat sinister tone. Immediately, Naruto began to feel strange as the truth serum began to take effect. Mito was sitting in class with an empty seat next to her that she had reserved for her brother. Today had easily been the worst day of her young life. Before class, she had been informed that her parents had been killed in action during a mission. Along with her brother, they were the first family she had ever had. Overall, it was agonizing to see them go. However, what made it worse was that she had yet to see her brother all day. She had been given the opportunity to sit out of class today, but she wanted to stay and wait for him. This whole situation was rather awkward, as none of her friends knew what to say to her. She was simply sitting in solitude praying that the events of this day were just some sick joke. The only person who didn't seem to be treating her any differently was the last Uchiha. This was likely due to the fact that he had experienced her pain on a much larger scale when his entire clan was killed in a single evening. Now she could finally understand why he was such a downer. As the class ended, she watched as every student filed out of the room, with some occasionally muttering condolences to her as they did so. However, she soon meets the eyes of the lone Uchiha survivor. She nodded in his direction and he paused in his step and nodded back before leaving with the rest of the students. There was a new unspoken understanding between the two of them. When she got up to leave, she saw the Hokage waiting at the door for her. She immediately sprinted towards him and wrapped her arms around him in a hug and began bawling her eyes out. He wrapped his arms around her gently, with a somber expression on his face. "I'm so sorry, Mito," he said. She was too distraught to respond, but she tightened her hold on him immediately. "Where is my brother?" she asked. "Where is Naruto?" Sarutobi closed his eyes and sighed in obvious frustration. "He has been placed in an orphanage near the outskirts of the village," he said. "I'm sorry, but due to reasons outside of my control, you two will be separated for a short time." For Mito, her entire world crashed before her eyes. Her brother, her rock, would be separated from her for the time being? That was impossible. She had never been separated from him before, and this only served to make her more upset. "Come, young one," Hiruzen said. "Let's get you home." As Sasuke was watching his classmates getting picked up by their parents, he couldn't help but think back on the words the blonde-haired boy had said all those years ago. He now knew the boy to be named Naruto Uzumaki, the brother of Mito. He was shocked to see him during their first ever academy class, but the boy never seemed to acknowledge that they had conversed in the past, so Sasuke kept to himself. Discovering that the boy was more talented than him in the ninja arts was a little disheartening. But Sasuke was not a jealous person, and he chose to focus more on his own development, rather than that of his classmates. However, when thinking back on what Naruto had said all those years ago, he couldn't help but acknowledge how right he really was. A year after their conversation, his brother had laid waste to their clan and sparked a hatred in him that still existed to this day. Naruto was right, expecting the best from life and the people you met in it only ended in disappointment. His faith in Itachi was clearly misplaced, and look where it got him. However, this was not to say that he liked the blonde Uzumaki. Quite the contrary, he despised his presence. He didn't actually hate the guy, but being near him only served to remind him about his tragic past, and how in the end, his opportunity to achieve his goal had been stolen from him. What an unpleasant world he lived in. 2 weeks later, Naruto was unaware of how long he had been in the facility up to this point. He was not informed of how many days had gone by, and the many experiments were making everything a blur. Currently, he was in a long, dimly lit room standing across from another young boy close to him in age. The supervisors had told him that in order for the children of the facility to earn their meals, they had to perform at a satisfactory level in their individual daily tasks. With the current task he was involved in being a battle to the death. They were each given a weapon of their choosing. The boy chose a katana and Naruto chose a chikudo. The boy rushed towards him first, clearly being the more hot-headed of the two. His movements were slow and sluggish to Naruto's eyes, but for someone so young he supposed it was somewhat impressive. He immediately made a diagonal slash towards Naruto's neck. However, it missed as his target leaned back at the last moment. Naruto proceeded to attempt a diagonal slash from the boy's navel to his collarbone. However, the boy too dodged at the last second. They charged each other once more and their blades collided with a vicious clang of steel. Naruto took this opportunity to look into the eyes of his opponent. He saw that underneath his aggressive exterior there was a terrified child simply looking to survive. He quickly jumped back while throwing his blade into the air. He followed up the maneuver with a series of hand signs, shocking the boy and the supervisors. "Wind style. Vacuum sphere," he said before releasing a series of air bullets towards his opponent. The boy, having little experience in ninjutsu combat, was taken off guard and killed instantly as one of the bullets went directly through his skull and brain. His body was hardly recognizable as it was leaking blood from where he had been hit by the other air bullets. Not one missed the intended target. After the fight's conclusion, a slow and methodical clapping could be heard from the observation balcony. "Excellent, excellent," Takejiro said, clearly very impressed. "I am surprised that you already possess such skill in ninjutsu. And your level of ruthlessness, excellent indeed." His voice lacked the usual faux politeness and was dripping with obvious satisfaction. He now knew why Danzo was so interested in this boy. During his interview with the child, he was shocked to learn that even while under the influence of truth serum, the boy was still an enigma, answering every question in a way that was very difficult to understand. It was as if they were attempting to converse with an extraterrestrial being not used to human conversation. However, one thing was clear: the child was a piece of art. Such art couldn't even be made in his facility. Only the hands of God could create such perfection. "You have done well during your stay here," he said to the boy as he addressed him once more. "However, I hear that you are resisting your treatment. Is this true, young man?" The treatment was one of the most crucial steps in the program. Through the influence of drugs and experimentation, the children would lose all their memories, and by extension their sense of self. However, he was resistant, not wishing to forget his sister. Danzo was correct. The girl was clearly holding him back from reaching his potential. The boy didn't respond to his inquiry, which caused the head supervisor to sigh in frustration. Danzo was also correct when he told him that the boy was not one for normal conversation. Through several tests, he was able to discover that the boy's chakra was unlike anything he had ever seen. He seemingly had affinities for all 5 nature transformations, which was unheard of for someone without the legendary Rinnegan. Which was why he checked the boy's eyes and made an astounding discovery. While the child did not possess the Rinnegan, or any of the other legendary dojutsu for that matter, he did have his own unique set of eyes. He was able to discover that these eyes are what granted the child an affinity for all 5 chakra natures. Furthermore, the eyes seemed to be very resilient to ocular genjutsu. However, unlike the Sharingan, they were unable to cast them. Finally, the most astounding thing about his eyes were the effect they had on his chakra. He could seemingly combine any and all of his chakra natures together with one another. The potential was limitless. He could perhaps one day use the wood release of the first Hokage, the lava release of the Yanbi, or maybe even the dust release of the Tsuchikage. And those were just the nature-based Kekkei Genkei that he could think of off the top of his head. He looked down towards the arena and saw that the boy was being escorted back towards his room. Yes, it seemed as though he had been gifted a truly rare gem indeed. 1 year later. Recently, a story had been circulating amongst the children in the facility. A story about a child who was always kept sedated using drugs and sleeping pills. The supervisors locked him underground because his words were evil and capable of destruction. The boy felt no fear, no hatred, no happiness, nothing. Eventually, he became immune to the sleeping pills, manipulated his jailers, and snuck back amongst the children. He hated of the facility and began to plot the demise of all those living inside. He would steal their memories to the point that they would not even recall their own names. He would manipulate them and lead them to their own violent downfall. The children would be unaware that they were being controlled, and it would lead to their destruction. Nobody knew if the story was true or not, but it created a lot of tension between everyone in the facility. What had been forgotten in the confusion and fear was that Naruto was the one who spun the tale to a small group of children, and it quickly spread throughout the facility. He did this in order to create enough disarray for him to be able to leave. The facility had become boring for him, and he would be interested in seeing what his sister was up to. There was already an intense level of hatred and tension amongst the children and staff members, even before he had arrived. He wasn't a god, he couldn't create something out of nothing. All he did was concentrate their hatred in a way that benefited him. However, his motivation wasn't strictly to see his sister again. That mattered to him, but there was much more to it. He wanted to see what lengths people's hatred could take them. He knew that hatred only came into existence when human beings began interacting with one another, but he was still young. He didn't have much experience observing the outcome that such hatred had on a population. It was ironic that he would be performing his experiment on those who wished to experiment on him. Speaking of which, in spite of their experiments, he had still not forgotten his sister, but many of his memories were lost. He felt like a husk of a person, like he didn't even exist. He didn't enjoy anything. He has no connection to anything, and he could not feel love or have empathy. He had no pleasant memories, no sense of identity, no parental love, and no joy in general with anything or anyone. Had he always been like this? Or was it something new? His lack of many memories made it impossible to answer either of those questions. But still, he often pondered that during his free time. However, he was pulled out of his thoughts when he heard several explosions ring throughout the facility. They were so powerful that his door was blown off of its hinges. He calmly walked out to an interesting sight. People were killing one another in droves. To them it didn't matter who it was that they were killing, all they cared about was their own survival. The supervisors were being overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of children. Naruto wondered if they were perhaps regretting teaching these children to be such efficient and ruthless killers? That would be humorous and rather fitting. As he walked through the halls he avoided the occasional corpse and continued on his way. He made his way up the stairs in the main hall and then sat in a chair that was waiting for him right at the top of the steps. He basked in his accomplishment. Many people were dying, simply because of a few words. This is what people truly are, he thought to himself. All I needed to do was fan the already existing flames until they became a roaring bonfire. Ironically, the building was beginning to go up in flames, likely due to the explosions. He closed his eyes and felt the heat from the fire tickling his skin. He felt no fear. He wouldn't die here. What was capable of killing a non-existent being? The past year had been a bizarre one for Mito. Being separated from her brother for so long was an incredibly unpleasant experience. In her worst dreams, she often wondered if Naruto had died and that old man Hokage was merely lying about him having to live somewhere else, to avoid her experiencing another heartbreak. However, she would always berate herself for thinking so negatively. If not for the issue of her missing brother, she would say that this past year had been perfect for her. Not too soon after the death of her previous foster parents, she was adopted into a new family. Her new parents were a little older than her previous ones, but they were no less kind. It took her a while to warm up to them, in fear of the pain she'd feel if she were to lose them. However, with her being the way she was, she couldn't help but begin to love them faster than any reasonable person would. Her new father was Shiro Akihiro. He was a fairly tall and portly individual with gray hair, brown eyes, and rosy cheeks. He wore thick-rimmed glasses and could always be found reading the newspaper with them every morning. To top it off, he wore a green long-sleeved shirt and a light green collared shirt underneath it and gray pants with black sandals. Her new mother was named Ito Akihiro. She was somewhat short and had a skinny build, giving her the appearance of being a weak person. She has neck-length, light brown hair with part of it held in a small bun towards the back. Furthermore, she had black eyes and wore a white apron dress with a long-sleeved maroon shirt underneath it. However, her appearance was not what warranted the attention of others. No, it was her renowned kindness that made her a staple within the community of Konoha. What put Mito at ease was that unlike her former parents, the Akihiros were not shinobi. She didn't have to worry about them going out on a mission and never returning. It did well to put her mind at ease. Not to mention, they were handpicked by old man Hokage, and she trusted his word above that of all others. Well, other than her big brother, that is. Upon thinking of her brother once more, she entered another short bout of depression. She hated the fact that she could never see him, and what made it worse was that nobody would tell her anything regarding the situation. She was pulled from her thoughts when her name was called. She looked up and saw Iruka-sensei looking at her expectantly. Being able to infer the reason for having her name called, she stepped forward until she was standing in the sparring ring located in the academy training ground. She was now focused on what was going on and was waiting for Iruka-sensei to announce her opponent. She had improved a lot in her taijutsu over the year, so she was confident in her ability to pull out a victory against just about anyone. However, everyone soon dropped what they were doing in favor of looking at the large column of smoke that could be seen rising in the distance. Danzo had an uneasy feeling. He had yet to hear from Takejiro regarding Naruto's progress, which was odd considering just how careful the man was. He was sitting in the office of his private residence and had told his rude Anbu guards that he did not wish to be disturbed. However, his unease was capped off when the giant pillar of smoke became visible from the direction of Orphanage 8. What could have happened? Has a foreign village attacked? Or perhaps Hiruzen had discovered the true nature of the facility, evacuated the occupations, and burned it down to send a message to him. His relationship with Sarutobi had become even tenser than ever. The increased tension was due to the Uchiha massacre and Danzo's involvement in the atrocity. As punishment, Hiruzen revoked Danzo's position as second in command, and his route was ordered to be disbanded. Furthermore, he was sentenced to be confined to his private home for an indefinite period. While he still led Root, which was still as active as ever, it made things much more difficult for him. He had been foolish in thinking that Hiruzen would allow him to continue doing as he pleased. Perhaps he had become arrogant due to his more recent successes? Regardless, Hiruzen demonstrated his cunning when he all but destroyed any and all influence Danzo held within the daimyo's court. It seemed that losing his position as second in command had made him lose his credibility. However, the most shocking development was Hiruzen putting his foot down before the daimyo. Even Danzo had to admit that it was an impressive sight to behold. Perhaps he had pushed Hiruzen too hard, and it resulted in him reverting to his older self? Regardless, the daimyo would no longer be sticking his nose in the business of the god of shinobi and his village. It was moments like these that made Danzo respect Hiruzen more than anyone else. He had always held the daimyo's influence upon the village in disdain. While it didn't stop him from taking advantage of that influence for his gain, it didn't mean that he liked it. Yes, it seemed Hiruzen had regained his spine. If not for Shisui's eye, Danzo was confident that he would have been locked in prison by now. So while it was the Uchiha massacre that took away a lot of his power, it was the fruits of the endeavor that saved him from a life of miserable imprisonment. He continued to gaze upon the pillar of smoke rising higher and higher into the sky. If not for the fact that it was so clearly coming from the village outskirts, he was sure people would be panicking. However, in the midst of his thoughts the lights in his office went out all at once, and it was plunged into darkness. Whoever was responsible had come at a terrible time. He had recently used Koto Amatsukami and therefore would be unable to use it against the interloper. Was it Hiruzen, here to arrest him? Or was it Itachi, here to make sure he kept his promise of staying away from Sasuke Uchiha? Perhaps it was Orochimaru, simply being, well, Orochimaru. Before he could address the one responsible, he felt a presence that sent a chill up his spine, standing behind his desk chair. The phantom had a kunai place against the leader of Root's neck and was almost drawing blood. Danzo absent-mindedly wondered if his guards had been killed. That'd be a pity. "Who are you?" he demanded in a stoic voice. He wasn't afraid of this intruder. The fear of death had abandoned him long ago. Or maybe it was because the figure had yet to kill him? "Hello, Danzo-sama," the figure eerily purred from behind his mask. Upon slightly turning his head, Danzo was able to notice that the intruder was wearing the uniform of one of his root guards. Danzo responded almost immediately, "I'll ask you once more, who are you?" His tone was as cold as ice and would make even the most seasoned shinobi tremble in fear. "I can't say," the figure absent-mindedly responded. The shadow's voice was oddly soothing. "However, I suppose I would most accurately be described as the monster without a name." Upon hearing this strange statement, Danzo was immediately able to tell who the intruder was. "Naruto Uzumaki," he said. "So you are the one responsible for that smoke in the sky. I should have known that such a place could never hold you." "I have dreamt of the end many times," stated the strange boy, once again seemingly ignoring the words of the one with whom he was conversing, "and yet, after the events of this day, I have come across something different altogether. A clearer vision of the true ending." "The ending for you or me?" Danzo asked. "One of them would likely die here today, but which one would it be?" he wondered. "The end of everything," the boy calmly retorted, almost before Danzo even finished his sentence. "In the end, humanity is destined to kill one another, until the day comes in which there is no one left. I intend to be the last one standing when that day arrives." "What of your sister? Will she die as well?" Danzo asked. This boy was truly beyond comprehension. "You speak as though Mito and I are separate entities," Naruto said, and Danzo could practically feel the smile behind the boy's mask. "She is me, and I am her." "You are insane," Danzo stated resolutely. There was no doubt in his mind that this child was severely ill. It was a shame, the boy had so much potential. However, Danzo was no fool. He knew such a person would never be molded into an asset for Konoha. The child would sooner be the reason for Konoha's destruction. Upon realizing the severity of his situation, he quickly moved to form a hand sign. None of his jutsu were fast enough to kill the Uzumaki child before he was murdered. His only hope would be to activate Izanagi before it was too late. It was moments like this that he cursed his lack of Uchiha blood. An Uchiha would be able to activate the jutsu without even needing to weave a single hand sign. However, before he could bring his hand up, he felt a painful sensation going through the front of his neck. When looking down, he saw that a dangerous amount of blood was leaking. He made to say something, but he found himself unable to speak. The boy had severed his trachea, preventing him from being able to yell. Furthermore, his experience with murder served to tell him that his carotid artery had also been severed. His body would be unable to send newly oxygenated blood to his brain. At this point, struggling for his life was pointless, as the boy had taken a grip on his arm to prevent him from forming even a single hand sign. He felt himself weakening quickly. His body subconsciously attempted to take a breath through his severed windpipe, but it only resulted in him gargling blood and coughing. This is what the true death of a shinobi is, right, Danzo-san? Naruto asked. Never seen the light of day, toiling in the shadows. That's the way of a true shinobi. At least, that was the mantra you constantly spewed at your underlings. It only fits that you die in such a dark and lonely place as this. Even while suffering from the pain of having his throat slit, he couldn't help but feel the need to shiver at the boy's voice. No matter what the situation was, Naruto always spoke with that eerie, serene tone. It was impossible to rattle him as he never seemed to get nervous or afraid. In fact, he couldn't even imagine the boy speaking in any other way, as it was the only way he'd heard him talk for as long as he'd known him. At least when he was younger, there was still a hint of innocence to it. But he supposed he was the one responsible for changing that. He thought he was creating an asset that would lead Konoha long after his death. However, the only thing he succeeded in doing was creating a monster. Which is why it was fitting that said monster was the one to take his life. I wonder what the world will think of you. Naruto asked while maintaining his tight grip on Danzo's chin. What will they think of the old root, hidden within the darkness? Even in death, will you ever be as revered and respected as the third Hokage? As the life began to leave his lone visible eye, Danzo began to think back on his past. He remembered his childhood, playing with Hiruzen. And he remembered his young adulthood and being jealous when Hiruzen was appointed as the third Hokage. Upon thinking back on the death of his sensei, he couldn't help but compare it to his own and felt disappointment. Self-sacrifice, that was what epitomized a shinobi. For what purpose had he sacrificed his life? None, he had simply had his throat slit like a pig while he was sitting in his office. However, he felt like it was a fitting death for one such as himself. Hiruzen, Danzo thought to himself in his final moments. It seems like it is my time. But in the end, I could never become Hokage. No matter how fast I ran, I was never able to catch up to you. You are a leaf, upon which light shines. I was nothing but a foundation, hidden in darkness. What do you think of someone like me? Danzo thought as his eye began to close. Hiruzen, he continued, what was I to you? And with that, the shinobi of darkness died. Kakashi Hitaki had seen a great many things during his lifetime. However, none of his previous experiences could have prepared him for what he saw today. He and his squad arrived at Orphanage 8 about an hour ago. After 10 minutes of attempting to quell the fire with many water-style jutsu, it was finally extinguished. They immediately checked the building for survivors and were dismayed when they found none. It was a grisly sight, with several charred corpses strewn throughout many of the rooms. However, what shocked Kakashi the most was the cause of death. The fire had killed none of these victims, so how did they die? I suppose this is the burden of our job, a voice behind him said, a voice he immediately recognized as his comrade, Tenzo. The former root shinobi continued, being forced to see sights like this. Isanbu have it rough, eh? We could have it worse, Kakashi responded while looking at a particularly young burnt corpse. A child so young had lost their life this evening. For what purpose? Who or what was responsible? You're right about that, Kakashi Senpai, Tenzo said in a somber tone, catching on to what his captain was implying. He continued, have we discovered the cause of death? Not yet, but at the very least we should be able to identify the bodies from their dental records. Thankfully, the fire wasn't hot enough to make their teeth unsalvageable, Kakashi observed with a level head. He'd need to put aside his emotions to do his job correctly. However, he couldn't help but wonder what Minato-sensei, Rin, and Obito would think of all of this. Surely, his sensei would have analyzed the situation with a much more level head than he could ever dream of possessing. They all killed one another, a wise voice, easily recognizable as belonging to the Hokage, said from behind the two operatives. Everyone within this facility killed each other, the signs are there. Kakashi sighed upon hearing this. He too had noticed the signs, but he had hoped that he was wrong. What would compel these children to take each other's lives? What kind of orphanage was this? Sir, an Anbu said while appearing before him. We have finished collecting the remains and have sent them in for analysis. Thank you, Kakashi said. You and the others are dismissed. Immediately after saying that, his squad, excluding Tenzo, performed a Shunshin jutsu and left the area. What do you think, Kakashi? The third Hokage asked, clearly valuing his subordinate's opinion. Kakashi responded after a few moments of thought. I believe that whatever was going on in this orphanage was not natural. It looks more like a mental institution. Naruto was a resident of this orphanage, the Hokage said solemnly, making Kakashi's lone eye widen in shock. That can't be possible, Kakashi thought in dread. How could Minato-sensei's son have lived in such a place? Was he found, Hokage-sama? Kakashi asked, afraid to hear the answer. He was spotted walking through the village not too long after we became aware of this incident. He is alive, but we have yet to find him, Sarutobi said. Kakashi didn't know if he should feel relieved that Naruto was alive or afraid at the fact that his sensei's son was now missing. Hokage-sama, I request that you allow me to lead the search party. Kakashi begged after kneeling before his leader. There will be multiple. However, I will allow you to lead one of the search parties, Kakashi. The Hokage said, understanding and admiring Kakashi's sense of duty. Thank you, Hokage-sama, Kakashi said before he too performed a Shunshin jutsu and left the area, with Tenzo following soon after. Hiruzen sighed upon looking towards the now pitch-black night sky. It seems that I have failed you, Minato, Kushina, he said, in a regretful tone that did well to demonstrate his advanced age. The news was everywhere. Apparently, a burning orphanage near the outskirts of the village was the source of the smoke in the sky. Tragically, there were no survivors. Sasuke sighed upon hearing the news. Such a tragedy was similar to what occurred to his clan all those years ago. Was Konoha simply a bastion of tragedy and death, or was the entire world like this? In the end, no matter how much he thought about it, he was never able to be sure. What he was sure of, however, was his need to kill his brother. He may not be able to change the world as a whole, but he felt responsible for his brother. How could he live in peace while his brother was out there doing who knows what? No, he would kill him, not only to avenge his clan but also to fulfill what he felt to be his responsibility to society. His thoughts drifted towards his fellow classmate, Mito Uzumaki. She was the only one who could understand his pain. Only she has experienced the loss of the people she loved. He supposed her brother had too, but he'd rather not think about the blonde-haired boy. The female Uzumaki twin was unlike her brother in so many ways. While their external appearances were nearly identical, minus the difference in hair color, they were like opposites. She was friendly and energetic, he was introverted and calm, she was near the bottom of their academy class, and he was at the top, at least while he was still enrolled. But most of all, there was one crucial difference between them. She had something that Naruto didn't have, and that was her expression. She had the most wonderful, human expressions on her face. Sasuke didn't particularly desire to be her friend, but he'd be lying if he said he didn't admire her ability to push through adversity while still maintaining that bright smile. Was it because she was stronger than him, deep down, where it counted? Or was she merely naive? It was hard to tell, but either way, he envied her apparent never-ending optimism. As he was making his way to his apartment, he remembered that today was July 18th. His birthday would be in 5 days. Not that it mattered to him. Upon realizing that the young Uzumaki boy would not be found through simple means, Kakashi went to the Konoha archive library to gain some more information. What he found, or rather, what he was unable to find, shocked him. There was almost no information on this, Orphanage 8. Other than the fact that it was funded by several people within Fire Country, however, their names had been sanitized. Whoever they were, they must have been rich, he thought to himself. The sheer value of the equipment within the facility astonishing. The funds required to purchase and maintain such equipment was likely vast. He attempted to check for any records of the purchases so he could find where they came from, but there was nothing. This whole process was beginning to frustrate him. Was he wasting valuable time here? The time that could have been used to search for his sensei's son? However, he soon found information of incredible value. He was not the only person to request access to this information. Within the past 50 years of Orphanage 8's existence, several people had made inquiries. Some names caught his eye immediately, however, the name at the bottom of the list shocked him. Tsukumo Hitaki, he whispered breathlessly. The date of his inquiry was not too long before his suicide. In fact, he visited exactly 11 days before the tragic event. Could there be a correlation? He wondered to himself. A relationship between this discovery and the death of my father? Perhaps he was reaching, but he had always found it odd that his father had taken his own life due to dishonor. No doubt it played a part, but could it have been the only reason? He put aside his thoughts in favor of getting back to why he came here in the first place. The mystery of his father could wait, but Naruto could not. For all he knew, the child could be in danger of dying. News of the tragic demise of the children of Orphanage 8 had spread throughout Fire Country very quickly. Much like when the Kyuubi attack and the Uchiha massacre had occurred, several temples throughout the vast country were hosting candlelit vigils. Naruto was walking along with a large group of mourners. His attire consisted of a loose-fitting, light blue kimono shirt with billowing sleeves that nearly reached his fingertips. It was tied by a thick dark brown Ono stylized belt. It was topped off with a pair of black Anbu-style pants with black shin-high sandals. People who had never even stepped foot into Konoha were getting teary-eyed during the head monk's speech. And in Naruto's opinion, it was very odd. After having narrowly escaped the village, he had decided to attend a vigil in honor of his fallen friends. After all, society dictated that it was the right thing to do. He wondered why people were pretending to care. Was it because, much like his reason for being here, society dedicated it? However, unlike him, who was only here ironically, these people were weeping for those they had never met before. He wondered how many of them would be willing to adopt an orphan child. All human beings are unique, with complex feelings and motivations. So why is it that in spite of all that, they have still united together since the beginning of history? The truth is, humans joined together due to their mutual fear of death. In spite of all their differences, all of humanity fears non-existence. Except for him, but he was different. He noticed a group of children acting out during the procession. Children were always the perfect example of a human's true nature. As children, all people are selfish and are unable to empathize with anyone honestly. It isn't until they experience the feeling of loss that they are truly able to understand the value of life. And when they discover the value of life, they immediately begin to fear death. After walking with the group of mourning sheep, he had begun to grow bored. He noticed an opportunity to leave unnoticed and took it. He found a narrow path within the woods and began to follow it, without any particular destination in mind. However, after several minutes of traveling, he felt a faint presence sneaking in the trees behind him. He immediately threw a handful of kunai at his target, but they were easily dodged. The figure landed on the path behind him, allowing him to get a good look. He wore a short black jacket with red straps over the shoulders, as customary of all root members. He also wore a high-collared, all-black outfit with a red sash around his waist and what appeared to be an apron over his pants, and carried several pouches with him and wore a pair of black gloves. Most notably, however, was that except for a small area around his nose and mouth, his features were covered by a mask. He also had a pair of glasses built into the mask, obscuring his eyes. After processing the information, Naruto was able to identify the man as Torun Aburame. After killing Danzo, he had taken a look through some of his ledgers and files. While there wasn't much information of value, he did learn a fair bit about some of Danzo's more notable soldiers. Torun was one of Danzo's most elite subordinates and would no doubt cause Naruto trouble if the situation wasn't handled properly. Torun Aburame, Naruto said in a calm and beautiful tone, for once being the person to initiate a conversation. I did not take rude Anbu for being men of vengeance. Without responding, the Aburame dashed at him with blinding speed, tanto in hand. Naruto managed to narrowly avoid the strike that would have put him in the market for some new insides. However, the rude Anbu predicted his maneuver and threw a set of shuriken in the direction in which he was about to land. Seeing as though he had little options, the blonde Uzumaki performed a quick substitution jutsu and hid in the foliage. He needed to think of a plan. Thankfully, Torun likely didn't have much knowledge of his abilities, while he knew a lot about the stoic Aburame. Enough to know that if the man coated any part of his body with his nano-sized venomous insects, he would need to avoid it at all cost. With stealth being his specialty, Naruto was able to remain unfound by the elite Anbu. However, he could not leave this man alive. Any unworthy person that saw his true face would not live to tell the tale. After thinking that, he made a single hand sign. Immediately, he could be seen jumping from the tree line and made a move to attack his opponent from behind. Torun seemingly predicted the move and made to counter it with a block. It was effective, and Naruto was forced to jump to the other end of the clearing. He was in his element, a battle to the death, testing the value of his life against that of another. However, he had little doubt that he would be the one walking away victorious from this battle. He quickly weaved through a series of hand signs and launched a relatively large fireball at his opponent. He was very well versed in a vast array of ninjutsu, with his favorite being fire style for obvious reasons. However, he did particularly enjoy wind style, with its ability to turn single spark of fire into a roaring inferno. With that thought in mind, he went through another string of hand signs. Wind style. Great breakthrough, he said just under his breath. The powerful blast of wind immediately hit the fireball and fulfilled its desired effect. The explosion of flames was massive, almost engulfing the entire clearing. The feeling of the heat on his skin took Naruto back to the events of 2 days ago. He couldn't help but compare the immense satisfaction he felt that evening to what he was feeling now. He found that this battle lacked the same mental intrigue. However, while outright killing a person wasn't as ideal as making them facilitate their demise, a fight was still a viable option in his eyes. As the fire began to die out, he noticed that there was no longer another figure at the end of the clearing. However, he was confident that the root Anbu was not dead. His suspicion was confirmed when he felt a presence behind him. The man was very close to impaling him with his blade. Naruto jumped back and opened one of the small scrolls from his pouch. Upon opening it, in a puff of smoke a Chikudo appeared, Naruto's preferred weapon of choice. The blade was made of beautiful, high-quality steel, and was longer than a typical Chikudo. The Tsuba, handguard, was made with iron steel laminate and was black in color, with the Kashira, butt cap, being made from the same material. The hilt of the blade was wrapped in black Suka Ito, wrap, and decorated with white, diamond-shaped Samigawa, ray skin wrap. He immediately drew the sword from its sleek, black wooden scabbard and prepared for battle. He charged his opponent in an attempt to catch him off guard. However, the Aburame parried his slash and then tried to deliver one of his own. It was a standstill, as they were both equally skilled in close-quarters combat. The Aburame, however, had a trick up his sleeve. A trick that would hopefully, if done correctly, put this monster down. He removed the glove from his right hand in a way to make sure his opponent didn't notice. As they ran at each other to trade blows once more, it struck. As Torun blocked the blonde Uzumaki's blade to the side, he reached for his exposed neck with his ungloved hand. It had become a dark purple, covered entirely in his venomous insects. This would do it, he thought. This is the end. The hand connected and he took a tight grip on the younger boy's throat. The insects began to spread immediately, extending all over his neck and down the blonde's chest. However, there was no pain on the boy's face. He truly was a freak. However, Torun looked down as he thought he felt a sharp pain in his chest. Upon further inspection, he saw the end of his opponent's Chikudo sticking out of his sternum. He turned his head and saw a perfect replica of the blonde standing behind him holding the blade. He turned back towards the one he had killed, and it smirked at him before popping in a cloud of smoke. A shadow clone, he thought. The boy tricked me with a shadow clone. When Naruto substituted himself into the tree line, he must have created a clone before sending said clone to fight him. Then the real him quietly waited for the best opportunity to land the killing blow. It was so unlike him to fall for such a trick. It seems that I let my emotions get the best of me, he thought. Danzo-sama, I failed you. And with that, he took his last breath. Naruto allowed his shoulders to relax once he realized the battle was over. Danzo was such a fool. He thought he succeeded in creating emotionless tools, and yet, His opponent died because he had let his emotions cloud his judgment. He looked at the corpse in utter apathy. He weaved through several hand signs before igniting the body in fire. It would be best for him to eliminate any possible evidence of his involvement. He looked back once more before continuing on his way. Mito was standing in front of a tree that had many slash marks on it. She was sweating profusely, which was rare since she had so much endurance. She tensed her muscles and sprinted towards the tree again. She began running up the tree, but the higher up she got, the slower she became. She had just made it past her highest previous mark before she felt her foot once again slipping against the bark. She quickly made another slash to mark her progress and fell gracefully to the ground. She had seen her brother practicing this exercise once before. He seemed to take to it much faster than she was now, but she didn't let that discourage her. For a while she was not as elite as her brother in terms of raw talent. She made up for it for her drive to never give up. Honey, her foster mother, Ito, called to her. Why don't you take a break? You've been at it all day. Mito ignored her. It was one of those moments in which she blocked out all outside noise and focused entirely on her thoughts. She had grown much in these since she was a young child, not just in size but also in spirit. Her attire was a sleeveless kimono-style blouse that was yellow in color and held closed with a green obi over a short-sleeved mesh shirt with a pair of dark blue shorts and brown shinobi sandals. She ran up the tree once more, and she made it higher than she had ever been able to before. However, her vision soon began to get spotty, and her body felt very light. She careened towards the ground at a fast speed and hit it with a loud thud. The last thing she heard was her foster mother screaming her name. Upon opening her eyes, Mito found herself in a bizarre location. For whatever reason, she was back at Konoha Orphanage. She was laying in her old bed and was wearing her old pajamas. She quickly realized something was wrong as she looked down at her body and noticed that she was significantly smaller. She looked over at the bed next to her and saw her brother lying in his bed, with his eyes glazed over. She made to jump in surprise but found that she had no control over her body. She noticed a man sitting at their bedside reading them a book. She listened intently to hear the words. The story was about a little boy who wandered the world, looking for his parents. He had never met them before, but he had faith that he one day would. He knew that they must have experienced some tough times. The people at the orphanage told him that his parents likely thought that they were in a situation that made them feel unsuitable to raise him. The matron even gave him a photo of them. As he searched, he came across several couples but found that none of them matched the picture that he was given. Nobody helped him, nobody cared. Soon, he gave up. He believed that no matter how far he traveled, he'd never find them. He cried for 5 days and 5 nights during his journey home. As he returned to his village, he passed a coffee shop that was 2 blocks away from the orphanage and immediately stopped. There, sitting at a table enjoying their day sat his parents. They wore beautiful clothes and seemed to be very happy. He went running towards them but immediately stopped. Seated in a high chair was a young child, a child with hair and facial features very similar to his own. The mother was spoon-feeding the child ice cream, and the father was laughing as most of it was getting all over the child's face. They all laughed together, their faces the perfect picture of glee. The boy was dismayed as he walked the other direction, realizing that his parents had not wanted him. He was alone. As soon as she heard the story end, she awoke with a start. However, this time she was no longer in the orphanage but in the hospital. She turned her head and saw her foster parents sleeping in chairs situated at the side of her bed. She immediately realized that what she had experienced was a dream. However, why did it feel so real? It was like she was just in the room, hearing that story. Was it a memory or merely a bad dream? Come to think of it, she wasn't even sure if her brain was capable of dreaming up such a depressing story. The message of the story was clear. Those who were orphaned were alone in the world, with nobody to love them. Who would write such a story? Clearly, someone who thought making orphaned children miserable was funny. She wondered what impact hearing such a story would have had on her young, tender psyche. But more importantly, how had it affected her brother? He seemed to have been listening to the story with extreme intensity. However, she immediately put the memory aside as being a mere dream. If she had ever been told such a story, she was sure she would have never forgotten it. Right? Sasuke was sitting in his regular seat at the academy, near the window. Most days he preferred only to ignore any and everything that was going on in the classroom. While he was the same age as most of his classmates, he often felt like he was an adult forced to interact with young children. The Nara boy, Shikamaru, could be considered the exception to the rule, but Sasuke found his laziness to be childlike in nature. Other than that, he couldn't think of a single person in the room with him what had a mature bone in their body. There were Sakura and Ino. Both were two girls so enamored with him that it was irritating. They didn't even know him, and yet they claimed to love him? What crap. Then there was Kiba, the most obnoxious person Sasuke had ever met. He had this unearned air of confidence that made Sasuke want to put him in his place. And he had, several times, during the sparring training sessions. The dog boy always made excuses, saying that if he could have used his partner, Akamaru, in the fight, he would have won. Relying on a dog to help you win your battles? How pathetic, and even more pathetic to make such a pitiful excuse. When going over all the irritating qualities of his classmates, his gaze went over to Mito's desk, and he remembered that she wasn't here today. Apparently, she had fallen and injured herself during training. At least someone other than himself spent time trying to improve themselves. He didn't care that she was near the bottom of the class in rankings. The fact that she put in the work brought her above all these other people in his opinion. He knew what it was like, trying to train hard enough to forget the pain. He had been in such a state for so long that he even forgot how his laugh sounded. He was confident that if someone ever managed to make him laugh, it would result in an awful raspy sound, caused by a lack of laughing experience. Geez, he thought to himself. Do I ever think positive thoughts? His attention was brought to the front of the room when it was announced that the class would be going outside for sparring. Perhaps today would be different? Perhaps someone would be able to challenge him. However, he doubted that would ever happen. Such a thought wasn't arrogant in his opinion. When you toss enough pigs off of a roof, you start to realize that they'll never be able to fly. It wasn't pessimism, it was fact. After following the other students outside, he stood a little off to the side as he waited for his name to be called. He didn't care enough to watch the other matches. He was only concerned with his development. What was starting to be stunted by a lack of real challenges. After a few minutes, he heard his name called, along with the subject of his previous thoughts, Kiba. The Inuzuka seemed to be eager to prove his superiority. Why he thought such a thing was ever going to be possible, Sasuke would never know. They stood at the center of the sparring circle, with both of them not wanting to make the seal of confrontation, both preferring to get things completed. However, they both obeyed protocol and made the sign. Kiba was the one to charge Sasuke, which was unsurprising. The Inuzuka boy's attacks were wild and sloppy as if he were a rabid beast. An obnoxious rabid beast that Sasuke would be happy to put down. Sasuke spent the next few moments weaving in and out of Kiba's attacks with practiced ease. To those watching, it didn't even look like he was trying. And for once, looks weren't deceiving. However, in the midst of the battle, Kiba managed to graze Sasuke's forehead with his middle and index fingers. Sasuke saw red. In place of Kiba, he saw Itachi, telling him how much of a foolish little brother he was, with the fake smile on his face. It was always what Itachi would call him after poking his forehead. For once, Sasuke became the aggressor. He unleashed a flurry of powerful strikes that shocked his opponent. One managed to hit the boy's jaw, and another his stomach. The Inuzuka boy collapsed on his back in pain, but Sasuke wouldn't relent. He jumped on top of his opponent and released a brutal barrage of punches against his unprotected head. Before he managed to kill Kiba, or at least cause him brain damage, he was roughly pulled off. Upon seeing Iruka-sensei's shocked and appalled face, he realized what he had done. Never before had he felt such an uncontrollable rage. He prided himself on his rationality, and yet he brutally attacked a fellow student for doing something they couldn't possibly have known would anger him. Was this how he would react when he saw Itachi? How could he defeat his brother, one of the most skilled and talented shinobi to ever grace the village, if he fought like such a wild beast? He immediately noticed the irony of it all. He had just finished criticizing Kiba for fighting like a rabid animal. Sasuke, his sensei shouted in anger. Go home, you clearly have something bothering you today. I won't allow any further infractions from you, do you understand? Sasuke nodded and then left the training ground. Passing by his fellow students, he noticed that even Ino and Sakura were giving him looks of trepidation. That's how he knew he'd messed up. As he was making his way to his apartment, he couldn't help but drift his thoughts over to his Uzumaki classmate. What would she have thought of his actions? And why did he suddenly care about her opinion? As if fate was guiding the steps he found that he was in front of the hospital. For some reason, he decided that he wanted to see Mito. Perhaps, he wished to explain his actions to the only person he felt could understand him. He approached the front desk and asked what room his classmate was admitted to. The nurse informed him of where to go, and he was on his way. Apparently, both of her foster parents went to work once they realized she wasn't in any real danger. That was good, as he wasn't too interested in meeting them. Before continuing, he took a look at his clothing to make sure there wasn't any Kiba blood on it. He was wearing a navy blue, short-sleeved shirt with a high collar, white shorts, and white arm warmers. Upon entering the room, he was relieved to see that it was, in fact, lacking any other visitors. He approached her bed and received a look that could likely be put in the dictionary next to the word confused. Funny enough, he was probably more confused than her. Why was he even here? As if she could read his mind, she spoke, "What are you doing here, Sasuke?" Sasuke merely shrugged his shoulders and took a seat in the chair facing the bed. It was relatively comfortable. It smelled like soap, which led him to believe that Mito's foster mother had been sitting there before him. "Is there something you needed?" she asked. "Honestly, you are the last person I'd expect to see visiting me here." "And why is that?" Sasuke asked. He didn't know if he should be offended or not by her question. However, even he had to admit, his visit was definitely out of character and unexpected. "Well," she said, pausing for a moment as if thinking about what to say. "I know that you and I aren't on bad terms or anything. But I didn't expect for you to end up visiting me before any of my friends did." Sasuke scoffed upon hearing this. What kind of friends wouldn't visit their injured friend in the hospital? And this was coming from the most introverted and antisocial person in the village. "Well, maybe you should find some new friends then," he responded. "Like you?" she teased. Even in such a bad condition, she was still up for teasing? How could he, an entirely healthy boy, be toiling about through the day complaining, while she was here trying to be positive? "I heard that you injured yourself while training," he said, trying to change the subject. "What kind of training were you doing?" For once, he was genuinely curious. What kind of training could cause a person to fall from such a height and hit their head? Was she trying to wrestle a hawk midair? Okay, even he found his last thought to be incredibly stupid. "I was doing the tree climbing exercise," she answered, much to his confusion. "What is the tree climbing exercise?" he asked. Was Mito a squirrel now? Well, once during lunch, he glanced over at her while she was eating, and she turned her body away, as if to prevent him from stealing her food, and began nibbling on her candy bar like a chipmunk while still looking at him in her peripheral vision. He remembered that he almost palmed his face at her goofy expression. So he supposed her being a squirrel wasn't too far-fetched. "It's an exercise in which you channel chakra to your feet and try to walk up a tree with no hands," she said. "It's tough. And dangerous, apparently," he quipped. "I'd imagine you're the first future Konoha shinobi to get brain damage while climbing a tree with no hands." "Shut up. Why are you such a b-hole?" she asked while crossing her arms in front of her chest. "B-hole?" he asked. "What are you, 8? They stared at each other for a few seconds before they both burst out laughing. On Sasuke's part, it wasn't much, merely a light-hearted chuckle. But he could hear it. He could hear his laugh in what felt like the first time in forever. And you know what? It was beautiful. It was an oddly foggy day on the river, and that was a sign of immense danger. However, the captain of the ferry had quite a bit of experience under his belt, so he wasn't worried. It was an easy job. He would simply need to transport people and cargo across the wide river and then go back. It typically took about 6 hours to do, with each half of the trip being roughly 3 hours long. A boring job, but an easy one. However, even he had to acknowledge that this fog was something he'd never seen before. He could hardly see anything, and his passengers were beginning to get uneasy. The children were huddled into their parents' chests, and the adults were doing their best to appear unafraid. He felt like he was in the beginning of some horror movie, and that he'd turn over his shoulder and see some sort of ghost ship pursuing them. It was a funny thought, really. But when you were as bored as him, you had to try your best to entertain yourself. "Can you feel that?" his co-captain asked. "It feels like we're being watched." "I've never felt such a feeling before, sir." "Keep your chin up," the captain responded. The moment we start getting afraid is when everything goes to shit. As the captains of this ship, we must set an example for those aboard by remaining calm." His co-captain nodded and then left the bridge of the ship, leaving him alone. It was what he preferred, being alone with his thoughts. He wouldn't consider himself a loner by any means. But sometimes it was better to just have some alone time. However, his instincts soon kicked in as he noticed something strange. A small boat was approaching the port side of his ship. It was small and looked like it could only hold 3 to 4 people. However, the oddest part was that it was entirely empty and engulfed in flames. It bobbed about the choppy river current and then collided with his ship. The difference in size was great, so it just bounced off like a gnat. However, it served the purpose of getting the attention of everyone on board. Before he could blink, several individuals scaled the starboard side of the ship. They were rather unruly-looking people and were armed to the teeth. It seemed like the empty boat was a distraction, and it worked. He looked towards the starboard side and saw several small boats, just like flaming one from earlier. However, they were obviously not in flames. He wondered when they were going to make their demands, but was shocked when one of them impaled a passenger. In his experience with pirates, they never immediately attacked, they made several requests first. The first murder sparked what could only be described as a bloodbath. The interlopers began slaughtering the passengers and crew with reckless abandon. The deck of the ship was starting to be soaked with blood. Dear God, they weren't even sparing the children. He felt a presence behind him and quickly turned. There was a man, who seemed to be a little distinguishable from the rest. He too was wearing the same crude leather armor, but he had the air of a leader. He had spiky brown hair and a face that was riddled with scars. However, what immediately grabbed his attention was his headband. It was a Kirigakure headband, but there was a slash mark going through it. This showed that the man wasn't an ordinary pirate like his comrades, he was a rogue shinobi. Before he could ask the man what he wanted, he was stabbed in the chest. It seemed like these weren't ordinary pirates after all. Today was the day that she would finally become a shinobi. Mito had not been this excited in a very long time. In spite of all the tragic events that seemed to follow her, she finally achieved her goal. She looked over to the other side of the room and saw Sasuke sitting in his typical, disinterested pose. Believe it or not, they hadn't spoken much since he visited her in the hospital. But that was okay with her, as she considered their friendship to be a more of an unspoken type of bond. A few days after his visit, she found out about his vicious assault of Kiba. A part of her wanted to approach him and tell him to apologize, but her instincts told her that she should mind her business. She knew Sasuke, and he wasn't the type to just randomly explode in rage. There must have been something going on in his head, something she could probably empathize with. She began paying attention once more as Iruka-sensei started announcing the teams. First, he told them how proud he was of their accomplishment. But he also told them not to become too complacent. This was merely the beginning of their journey, not the end. He first announced Team 10. Saying the members would be Ino, Choji, and Shikamaru. He then stated that their sensei would be a man named Asuma Sarutobi. Ino didn't seem too happy about her team. She laid her head down in her arms and groaned in despair. Mito frowned a little at seeing this. It didn't seem fair to Ino's new teammates for her to be behaving in such a way. However, when looking at them, Shikamaru wasn't even awake, and Choji was too engrossed in his bag of chips. They were sitting next to each other since they were known to be best friends. Next, Iruka-sensei announced Team 8, since Team 9 was already an active genin team. He said that the team would consist of Kiba, Shino, and Hinata. Apparently, their sensei would be Kurenai Yuhi. Mito cared a lot for Hinata. She had once saved the Hyuga heir from bullies, and they'd been friends ever since. In fact, she would argue that they were best friends. And finally, Iruka-sensei announced Team 7. Her ears perked up when she heard her name called first, followed with Sasuke's and Sakura's. Their sensei would be some guy named Kakashi. However, immediately after listening to the announcement, Sakura jumped in celebration. She was with her friend and the love of her life. How could it get any better? Mito glanced over towards Sasuke and noticed that he was already looking at her. They both nodded to each other in acknowledgement. The unspoken message was clear, they'd succeed together. Kakashi sighed. Today was another day in which he would be forced to take on a genin team. He hated it so much. He felt as though the Hokage was forcing him to do this to make him socialize. For the past year, he had been a man on a mission. He had investigated any possible angle about orphanage aid and the location of his sensei's son. He wasn't able to learn much, but what he did learn was very important. Apparently, the facility was not under the jurisdiction of the Hokage. In fact, it technically wasn't even a Konoha facility. It fell under the purview of the Land of Fire and was controlled by the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Both of these factions were a part of the government that presided over the entire nation. Furthermore, he discovered that most of the occupants were either children with criminal records or the children of criminals. The son of the fourth Hokage did not belong in such a place. On another note, Danzo Shimura had been found dead in his private residence a day after the orphanage burned down. It appeared as though his throat had been slit roughly 4 hours after the building went up in flames. To Kakashi, this proved that Danzo was somehow involved with Orphanage 8. He couldn't prove how, but he knew it to be true. It seemed like something Danzo would do anyway. He stopped his train of thought in favor of looking up at the academy building. He had, apparently, reached his destination without even noticing. He sighed, dreading what he had to do. Sometimes he wished he had the enthusiasm of his rival, Maida Guy, but then he remembered the odd man's green spandex and purged those thoughts from his mind. He absent-mindedly noticed that he was 4 hours late. However, that was nothing new, so he shrugged it off. When standing before the sliding door of the classroom, he felt a moment of seriousness. He would be looking after Minato-sensei's daughter for the foreseeable future. He would not let her down like he had let her brother down. He sighed once more, and then opened the door. The Coast Guardsman was feeling a little irritated. For whatever reason, a ferry scheduled to arrive 2 hours ago had yet to show up. They checked and discovered that it had, in fact, left on schedule. The entire situation was odd. However, he attributed it some irritating problem with the ship's engine. As he made his way through the river, he noticed something in the distance. It was the ferry, there was no doubt about it. He increased the speed of his boat and set sail towards his target. The closer he got, the more uneasy he became. "Why is there nobody visible on the ship?" he muttered. He stopped next to the ship and noticed the charred remains of a small boat. What on earth was going on here? He quickly and efficiently boarded the vessel. However, as he turned to examine the deck, his eyes widened in shock. It was a bloodbath, nobody survived. He slowly made his way towards the bridge of the ship, hoping some answers may be there. But upon entering, he immediately regretted his decision. He bent over and vomited. On the ship's wheel was a horrible sight. The captain's severed head had been impaled on one of the wheel's handles. He stayed bent over, with his hands on his knees, breathing heavily. "I need to report this," he said. "I need to report this immediately. This is beyond me." Faster than he had ever moved before, he ran towards his boat. Once he was situated behind the wheel, he started the engine and was on his way to the mainland. The local authorities needed to hear about this. What a day it has been, Sasuke thought while making his way home. He was shocked to learn that he was not quite a genin yet. However, he had no issue with completing a survival exercise. He turned a corner but stopped immediately. Right in front of his face was a growling dog. The beast was nearly the size of a wolf, and it was accompanied by 2 of its brethren. Standing behind them with her arms crossed over her chest was a young woman. A woman he recognized to be Kiba's older sister. "Damn it," he thought, "I don't have time for this." He tried to walk around them, but the hounds immediately blocked his path once more. "Where do you think you're going?" the woman growled, practically seeming like a dog herself, rather than a human being. She had long brown hair which she wore in a ponytail with 2 locks of hair framing her face over her large, black eyes. She also wore a light shade of lipstick and had the traditional fang-like tattoos of the Inuzuka clan on both of her cheeks, in addition to a tattoo on her upper right arm, resembling a flower. She was wearing a form-fitting variation of the Konoha flak jacket which doesn't have any chest pockets, and she kept the front of her jacket unzipped, exposing her cleavage. She also wore a pair of form-fitting shorts cut just above the knee, and bandages just below her tattoo and wrist warmers. He glared right into the face of the ninja hound, showing no fear. While he was doing this, however, the other 2 dogs circled around him, so that he was surrounded. "I heard that you became a genin," Hana said. "Do you know what that means?" Sasuke didn't answer. having no interest in entertaining the nonsense of the feral-looking woman. She continued as if she didn't even care about his reply. "It means that you and I are now allowed to have a friendly spar. However, I'm feeling a little too excited. I don't think I'm patient enough for us to walk all the way to the training ground. You're excited too, right? Let's fight here." As she said that, her dogs lowered themselves closer to the ground. They growled, foaming at the mouth. It was as if the Uchiha survivor was facing off with 3 monsters. He absent-mindedly wondered if they would try to eat him? That would suck. It was evident that this sparring invitation was motivated by his beatdown of Kiba a year ago. The Inuzuka boy had to be hospitalized for several days and was unable to attend the academy for a few weeks. As if reading his mind, she growled, "Did you think we had forgotten? My little brother might be a young pup, but I'm not. Let's see if you can handle a more skilled opponent. I'm warning you," Sasuke responded, in his typical, irritated tone. "If you attack me, I won't show any mercy." They both tensed their muscles. However, it was clear to him that before he could get to the Inuzuka woman, he'd have to fight off her rabid beasts. He wasn't afraid. In the past, he'd stared into the murderous Sharingan eyes of Itachi Uchiha. This, in comparison, was child's play. However, before the confrontation could escalate into a battle, an admittedly intimidating presence made itself known. "Hana, what do you think you're doing?" the Inuzuka matriarch, Sume, yelled. "Are you trying to disgrace our clan?" The head of the Inuzuka clan was quite a sight to behold. She had an animalistic look similar to that of her son, with long, spiky, untamed brown hair, vertical slit-like pupils, elongated canine teeth, and nails. She also had the clan fang markings on her cheeks as well as markings over her eyes and a dark shade of purple lipstick. She wore the standard outfit of a Konoha, consisting of an olive-green flak jacket and a black suit underneath with the sleeves rolled up and bandages around her legs. Standing next to her was an equally intimidating ninja hound. The dog was wolfish in appearance and was missing its left ear. It also wore an eye patch over its right eye. "But mother," Hana yelled in objection, "he deserves it. He hurt one of our own." "I know," the mother growled, glaring murder in Sasuke's direction. "But this is not the way to deal with it. Besides, you have no right to fight on your brother's behalf. It's his honor that is at stake, not yours." Hana made to speak again, but she was silenced with another intimidating glare from her alpha mother. She lowered her head in frustration and called off her dogs. She turned to leave, but not before giving Sasuke another glare. A glare that he returned. And with that, she was gone. "You think just because you suffered a tragedy it justifies your behavior?" Sume asked Sasuke, who was surprised to be addressed by the woman. He'd half expected her to leave with her daughter. He just walked by her, ignoring her completely. He had to get home, it was getting late. This morning sucks, Sakura thought to herself. She had just woken up at the crack of dawn and was making her way towards the training grounds. Yesterday her new sensei had told her equally new team that they weren't quite genin yet and that they had to perform a survival examination the next morning. In her dreams, she had thought that being on a team with Sasuke would be her first step towards love. However, even now that they were teammates, he still wouldn't so much as glance in her direction. Upon thinking about her crush, she couldn't help but think back on the day he had nearly scared her to death. Seeing him brutally beat down Kiba in that spar was one of the most terrifying things she had ever seen. The look in his eyes, it was as if he had been possessed by a demon. However, it hadn't, even for a moment, deterred her love of him. Nobody was perfect, even him. Team 7 had been waiting at the training ground for roughly 3 hours after they were told they needed to arrive. This was ridiculous, weren't Jonin supposed to carry themselves as professionals? So far, their gray-haired sensei had done nothing to prove that he was anything special. Mito was almost thinking about leaving. It wasn't like she was an incredibly busy person, but this seemed like a waste of her time. However, before she could even think about moving, a blur appeared in the center of the clearing. Frankly, they were all impressed by their sensei's speed. However, upon noticing his disheveled appearance, any and all admiration went out the window. All right, the masked Jonin said. "It seems that it's time to get started." He had been watching them for the past 20 minutes. He wanted to see how they acted when nobody was watching. And honestly, minus the occasional attempt of Sakura trying to talk to Sasuke, they were pretty quiet. How boring. He pulled a pair of bells from his pouch. reveling in the looks of confusion on the young academy students' faces. As you can see, I have 2 bells in my hand. They're kind of cool, right? His students were unimpressed. Tough crowd, Kakashi mumbled under his breath. Alright, the goal of this exercise is to take one of these bells from me. His 3 students perked up at hearing that. However, after hearing his declaration, they were all confused. Sensei? Sakura asked in trepidation. There are only 2 bells, and yet, there are 3 of us. Very impressive, Sakura, you can count, Kakashi said. However, as complicated as that might have been, it wasn't part of the test. So no points for you. He found a disturbing amount of pleasure at seeing the pink-haired girl's angry expression. However, he quickly noticed the red-headed Uzumaki girl snickering. What are you laughing at, tomato? He asked. And immediately she grew silent, perhaps embarrassed at having been caught. Alright, as stimulating as this conversation has been, let's move on, the gray-haired Jonin said. Since there are 2 bells, it means that only 2 of you will pass, and the other will be going back to the academy. The eyes of each of his 3 students widened in shock. Yes, even Sasuke's. What a creepily dull kid. You'll need to come at me with the intent to kill if you wish to succeed, Kakashi added. You have until lunch. Oh, I almost forgot. The one who fails will be tied to one of those 3 stumps. And they'll have to watch everyone else eat. However, if you all fail, you'll all be tied to the stumps. And you'll have to watch me eat. As their sensei said this, their stomachs growled. So that was why he'd asked them to skip breakfast. What an asshole. Your time begins now. Start, the Jonin said. As soon as he said this, his students jumped from the clearing into the trees. He thought, perhaps they're not as hopeless as I thought. Sasuke was perched in a tree, quietly observing his sensei. Was this man for real? He was openly reading an acclaimed erotic novel, occasionally perversely giggling. He saw this as his chance, and drew 2 handfuls of shuriken and launched them at his sensei's unguarded back. However, when they hit, he was shocked to see a wooden log in place of the masked Jonin. A substitution, he urgently thought to himself. He immediately made a beeline towards another section of the wooded area. He had given up his position with his previous attack. Perhaps this Jonin wasn't as incompetent as he appeared. Mito, too, was waiting on a tree branch. She had been shocked when she saw the group of shuriken impale the gray-haired Jonin's body. However, she soon noticed the log that was left in his place. It would have been sad for a Jonin, one of the village's elite, to die in such an embarrassing way. She quickly looked about the woods, attempting to locate her sensei's position. Suddenly, she was forced to jump when a group of kunai landed where she had been seated. He was still reading that stupid book. But Mito wouldn't let her disgust affect her ability to think clearly. Anyone who could be irritated by the reading habits of another person was oversensitive. She drew a kunai from her pouch and put it in front of her in a defensive position. However, when she noticed that he was refusing to move, she made to attack. She was fast, faster than anyone in her class, except Sasuke. As she went to stab her sensei in his face, he effortlessly dodged. She followed up the attempt with a slash towards his abdomen. However, before she could even blink, she was knocked into the center of the clearing. Sakura was nervous. How could she be the one to pass? She wasn't stupid, she knew Mito's ranking in the class wasn't an accurate depiction of her abilities. And Sasuke? Succeeding in something that he was unable to do seemed as likely as someone launching the moon towards the earth. However, she was soon taken out of her thoughts when she saw the red-headed Uzumaki launched into the center of the clearing. Should she help? Before she even considered her options, she jumped into the clearing, standing at Mito's side. Come on, the pink-haired academy student said. We need to hide. The girl looked up at her in appreciation. It made her feel really good inside. A part of her said that helping Mito would be foolish. But the beautiful look of gratitude on her teammate's face was well worth the risk. She placed the Uzumaki's arm over her shoulder and jumped back into the trees. Sasuke was stealthily traversing the wooded area. He hadn't seen his sensei since the exercise had begun. It was times like this that made him wish he had unlocked his Sharingan. Locating the masked Jonin would be so much easier. However, as if luck was on his side, Kakashi appeared before him. The unruly bastard was still reading his book. He'd fix that right away. He weaved through various hand signs and smirked when he saw his sensei's lone eye widen in surprise. Fire style. Fireball jutsu, he said. Immediately after, a giant fireball careened towards its intended target. When the smoke from the attack faded away, there was nothing left. That was odd. The fireball jutsu was powerful, but it wasn't hot enough to burn a person to ashes. He quickly noticed the hole in the ground where Sensei was once standing. The Uchiha survivor jumped into the air as two hands popped out of the ground and reached for his ankles. Mid-air, he formed another set of hand signs and launched another fireball down towards the two appendages. After the attack had hit, he landed a few feet away. This time wary of any attack from any direction. Left, right, below, or above, he'd be ready. Much to his surprise, he found the Jonin standing in the aftermath of the inferno, completely unharmed. He narrowed his eyes in frustration. Okay, he admitted, this guy is definitely no joke. Wow, the Jonin said. That was kind of hot. The Uchiha gritted his teeth upon hearing the obvious taunt. The Jonin looked up from his book at the Uchiha. Oh sorry, I didn't see you there. I was talking about this particular chapter in my book. It's pretty hot stuff. The smug look soon left the Jonin's face. And shockingly, Kakashi pocketed his perverted novel and said, alright, jokes aside, it seems like I'll have to give you a bit more of my attention. The Uchiha smirked, his blood boiling for a good fight. 2 hours had passed, and it was nearly time for the drill to end. Mito didn't know how Sasuke was doing, but it couldn't have been much better than her and Sakura. They had several encounters with the masked Jonin after teaming up, all of which resulted in either pain or humiliation. She was tired, and she and Sakura were walking through the woods, looking for Sasuke. They'd need him if they had any hope of victory. However, she was soon shocked to see Sasuke's prone from on the ground, with a figure sitting on his back. The Uchiha heir was leaking blood and looked to be in bad shape, if not dead. However, what shocked her the most was the identity of the figure. It was her brother, looking as polite as ever. But in the current circumstances, it only served to creep her out. Hello, sister, he greeted in a voice that she hadn't heard in years. Naruto, what are you doing here? Where have you been? And what have you done to Sasuke? She all but demanded. She absent-mindedly noticed that Sakura was no longer in the clearing with her. It was strange. Why can't you remember? He asked, ignoring her question entirely. Why can't you remember, Mito? Remember what? She asked, confused. However, as soon as she made her inquiry, the scenery changed. She was no longer in the woods and found that she was in a dark room. Looking right at her was a perfect copy of her younger self. The copy was wearing a white kimono, and her long red hair flowed down her back. She looked down at her own appearance. She noticed that she was wearing the same outfit. It seemed she was once again in her younger form. The copy was holding a children's book in her hands. However, she was unable to make out what it was. Welcome home, the copy said. She was suddenly brought back to reality. Her eyes opened to see Sakura and Sasuke kneeling in front of her. What had happened? Are you okay, Mito? Sakura asked, very concerned for her teammate. Yeah, what happened? Mito groaned. She absent-mindedly noticed the back of her head hurt. You fell for one of Kakashi's genjutsu, Sasuke said. They're a pain, I've had to deal with several of them myself. But you suddenly screamed and then fell and hit your head. You were unconscious for a few minutes. From what I can tell, the pain from the fall extinguished the genjutsu. What? She thought to herself. Did that mean the second part of her vision wasn't caused by genjutsu? Was it another one of those strange dreams? I've studied genjutsu a lot, Sasuke said. You were put under an advanced version of the hell viewing technique. It makes the victim experience their greatest fears. Sakura looked at Sasuke in admiration. This was the most she had ever heard him say before. What a day this had been. How much time do we have left? Mito asked, concerned for herself and her team. As soon as she asked, a shrill ringing sound bounced around the training ground. She looked down in dismay. They had failed. Not a single one of them managed to get a bell. Suddenly, Kakashi appeared before the three would-be genins. He looked infuriated. I can't believe it, I expected a better performance from all of you. He said, obviously disappointed. The three 12-year-olds looked down in shame. They were probably even more disappointed than the masked man was. You, he began, in a tone that made them cringe. For some odd reason, the sky filled with clouds, only serving to make him even more terrifying. Pass, he finished in a much more pleasant tone. The clouds immediately cleared and rays of sunshine could be seen. What? Sakura asked, clearly surprised. But none of us managed to get a bell. It doesn't matter, that wasn't the actual objective of the test, Kakashi said, sounding mildly pleased. The three genin were dumbfounded. They had been chasing after those infernal bells for what felt like days, and it was for nothing. The objective of the test was something more important than any jutsu, Kakashi continued. Mito, Sasuke, and Sakura practically leaned forward in anticipation. If that was the case, what was this critical objective? The objective was, the masked Jonin said. Teamwork. They all blinked in confusion. They never would have guessed that the test had a secret meaning behind it. But thinking back on it now, it made sense. The bells had been a ploy to attempt to divide them. It was actually brilliant, now that they thought about it. If comrades that you trust gather around you, hope can take physical form and become visible. That's what I believe, the gray-haired Jonin said. Oftentimes as shinobi, you will find yourselves transfixed with the rules and the mission. But there is something that you should do well to never forget, he continued. You see that stone over there? He asked, pointing at an odd, black kunai-like structure. It was clearly a statue of some kind. That's the memorial stone. On it are the names of some of the greatest shinobi in the history of this village. Really? Mito asked. What does a person need to do to get their name put on that stone? Everyone on the stone has one thing in common, the masked Jonin said. They have all died in the service of this village. This piece of information took the wind out of the genin's sails. In the shinobi world, those that break the written and unwritten rules are deemed trash. But be that as it may, those that would disregard their comrades so easily are even worse than trash. And those who don't have the decency to respect the memories of their comrades are the worst. Kakashi said the most serious they had ever heard him. They were shocked at his words. Maybe this guy wasn't so bad after all? It had been 3 weeks since they had passed the survival test, and Team 7 had been forced to do tedious D-rank missions ever since. They could hardly be called missions, they were more like chores. What made it worse was that Kakashi wouldn't help at all. He'd spend the entire time reading his stupid book. He may have earned their respect after his words in front of the memorial stone, but he was still annoying. It was early in the morning, and Team 7 found themselves standing in front of the mission assignment room located in the academy. Perhaps today they'd finally be issued a challenge? Well, the third Hokage said after seeing them enter. It seems Team 7 is here bright and early today. So what will it be, Kakashi? Weed pulling, dog walking, or perhaps fence painting? The masked Jonin contemplated. Why not all of the missions? They sound like so much fun. If I may interject, Mito stated, getting everyone's attention. I understand the necessity of such missions. But would it be possible for us to get something a little more stimulating? The Hokage looked at her for several moments, and finally, he spoke. Well, I suppose I could give you a D rank that requires you to leave the village? How about that, Kakashi? Sounds fine to me, Kakashi said. His team wondered if he'd accept anything proposed by the elderly Hokage. What does the mission entail? It's rather simple. It requires you to help load cargo on a ship that will be crossing a large river in eastern Fire Country, the old man responded. Afterwards, you will accompany the occupants of the vessel and help unload the cargo once the destination is reached. After he said that, someone knocked on the door behind him. The figure entered, dressed like someone who definitely worked in manual labor. This is your client, the Hokage said. Make sure to treat him well. They all glanced back, and their client gave them a slight bow. It was backbreaking work. Most of the cargo the three genins were forced to load onto the ship was really heavy. It made them respect the people that had to work such a job every day. At this point in the mission, they had finally set sail towards their destination. The ship Team 7 was occupying wasn't very aesthetically pleasing, but to the young genin, it was still impressive. None of them had ever seen a ship before, or such a large body of water for that matter. Before they could even comment on the vast water, a dense fog began to spread, blocking their vision. Kakashi narrowed his single eye in suspicion. He lifted his slanted headband and revealed a hidden, three-tomo Sharingan eye. He immediately was able to see that the fog was loaded with chakra, showing that it was definitely not natural. Team, Kakashi said, after covering his Sharingan. After he had gotten their attention, he continued. Prepare for a fight. The three genin tensed. Sakura looked particularly nervous. Sasuke had his regular aloof expression. However, there was an anxious edge to it, and Mito looked like she was preparing for an unpleasant experience. All in all, Kakashi was feeling pretty good about it. As he made that thought, something strange appeared in the distance. It was a small, flaming boat. Kakashi's experience told him that it was a diversion. He looked over to the other side of the ship and saw that he was correct, as it was being boarded by many rough-looking individuals. Kakashi hadn't seen such bloodthirsty expressions since that last war. These people were clearly insane, but he sensed almost no chakra from them, so at least they weren't shinobi. Sakura, protect the passengers. Mito, Sasuke, you're with me, he ordered. The battle was pretty lopsided considering it was 3 shinobi versus a bunch of armed pirates. Sasuke was doing particularly well, having taken down multiple opponents so far, without any real issues. Mito was also very impressive. Her fighting style was not as refined as Sasuke's, but it was almost as effective. Her strikes were powerful, and her body was flexible, giving her a wide range of attack motion. The way her long red ponytail moved about during combat was mesmerizing to the crew that was watching. However, Kakashi soon felt a dangerous presence behind him and had to block a sword slash that was intended to decapitate him. He got a good look at his opponent and immediately knew who it was. It was Suto Yuji, a B-ranked missing nin from Kirigakure. The man's face was riddled with scars, showing Kakashi that he had likely experienced many battles in the past. Kakashi of the Sharingan, Suto said. It is an honor to meet a shinobi as renowned as you. Sasuke narrowed his eyes upon hearing the scarred man speak. Kakashi of the Sharingan? What was this nonsense? A non-Uchiha bearing such a title was ludicrous in Sasuke's opinion. I won't need it to deal with you, Kakashi said, not looking the least bit intimidated. He dealt with worse before. Before the fight could begin, however, Suto raised his right hand in the air, signaling for retreat. We'll meet again, Hitaki, don't you doubt it. Kakashi was happy the battle hadn't escalated any further. Regardless of his superior skills, Kakashi wasn't too keen on fighting a former mist shinobi on such a large body of water. He was also happy for his students' sake. They could only handle so much in one day. He looked at his squad and noticed that Sakura had captured one of the pirates. The pink-haired girl surprised him with her usefulness. Under her protection, none of the crew had been harmed. And she captured an enemy too? It was impressive, to say the least. The rest of the trip went off without a hitch. Once they reached the mainland, however, Kakashi would need to have some words with their new friend. Team 7 was standing before their prisoner. They had arrived on the mainland several minutes ago, and they immediately tied the pirate to a tree. The pirate awoke from his slumber with a start and immediately dreaded his position. Standing before him were the 4 freaks that dealt with him and his comrades like they were nothing. And he was captured? Suto was going to murder him for such incompetence. Well, the leader of Team 7 said with an eye smile. Looks who's awake. What the hell do you want? The pirate demanded. He was trying to appear unafraid, but truthfully he was terrified. The black-haired kid to the left was giving him a very intimidating glare. I'd like for the two of us to get to know each other a little bit, the masked Jonin said. How about you go first? What was the reason for you attacking our ship? These waters aren't known for piracy. If I tell you, will you let me go? The captive practically begged. The scoundrel valued his life more than his honor. It won't hurt your chances, Kakashi chirped, making another creepy eye smile. Okay, we were paid to do it. I don't know who it is. None of us do, not even Suto. The payments and instructions were left anonymously. What were the instructions? Kakashi asked. Whoever it was, wanted us to murder and ransack any ship that went through these waters. Before all this, we weren't so violent. We were just ordinary pirates, stealing cargo and leaving survivors. The pirate exclaimed. Do you have any idea as to who it might have been? Kakashi asked, demonstrating his impressive patience. No clue, but Suto is pretty sure that it's that shipping tycoon in Wave Country, Gato. Apparently, he and the officials of this port have been rivals for quite some time. The boss thinks Gato is trying to hurt his competitor's business. Personally, I agree with him. The amount of money we received for this job was huge. Only someone like him could have paid that much. Thanks for the info, bud, Kakashi said, before knocking the prisoner out once more. They'd bring him to the local authorities after this. After dropping off the scumbag, Team 7 was seated in the office of the port's head officials. It was a very pristine and well-kept room. Each of the shinobi were given comfortable seats in front of the 3 desks of the people they were speaking to. The man on the left was a rather stout individual. He wore a nice gray suit and had slicked back brown hair with rosy cheeks. All in all, he looked like a very jolly person. Out of the 3 occupants in the office to greet them, he was the most sincere. His name was Akiyama Kei. The person on the right was actually a female. She appeared to be in her late 30s and was very good looking. She was thin, with light blonde hair that she kept in a ponytail. To top it off, she wore an expensive-looking pantsuit. Her name was Mai Hanako. The man seated in the center, clearly the one in charge, was a stern-looking man. Much like his partners, he wore an expensive suit. He had a bald head, but it only seemed to add to his intimidating presence. He was actually someone Kakashi had heard about before. His name was Suzuki Okakura. So, Suzuki began, I hear that you have identified the individuals responsible for the atrocious murders. Yes, they are a group of pirates led by the B-ranked missing nin, Suto Yuji, Kakashi responded. If you don't mind me asking, why is it that you didn't warn the incoming ships about the danger? I heard there have been 4 so far that have been wiped out. We didn't want to cause a panic, Mai answered eloquently. We believed that we could handle it without having to cause a ruckus. It seems we underestimated our enemy. Mito clenched her hands upon hearing this. Hundreds of people had died because they didn't want to cause a ruckus? That was the most ridiculous thing she had ever heard. Before she could express her indignation, someone else spoke. It seems to me that you were just too worried about losing money. Everyone in the room turned towards Sasuke, surprised to hear him speak. Before now, he was the only person in the room who had yet to say anything. You should watch what you say, boy, the female official warned. You shouldn't speak on things you know nothing about. I may not know much about shipping, but I do know a lot about selfish actions that cause destruction for others, the young Uchiha retorted, having had experience with Itachi, who killed their entire clan to test the limits of his ability. If that wasn't selfishness, then he didn't know what was. Kakashi-san, Suzuki interrupted before things could escalate any further. Did you learn anything else of value? Not quite yet, Kakashi responded. However, I'd like to take a look at the lists of those killed, if you don't mind. Kakashi was getting one of those feelings. The feelings he got when something was more than it seemed. Of course not, we don't mind at all, Suzuki said. He called his secretary over and asked the young man to retrieve the file and to bring it here at once. When he laid his lone eye upon the document, he read through it with practiced efficiency. Most of those killed had been either the crews of the ship and civilian passengers. However, one name, in particular, caught his eye. Mura Ichio. It was one of the few names that he found in association with Orphanage 8. For a time, he was the head of the Fire Country's Ministry of Health. A highly respected position within the government. But for whatever reason, he recently went missing. Kakashi searched high and low for the man and could not find him. So the man had been attempting to flee by boat? It seemed his instincts were correct. Something was amiss here. I notice that something has caught your eye, friend, Akiyama said in a happy tone. Would you be willing to share it with the rest of us? Through information I have gathered thus far, I am still unable to find the identity of the one responsible. However, I can make some sense of these murders. Kakashi said. Well, Mai began. Get on with it. She was obviously still irritated with Sasuke's previous comments. Whoever paid the pirates to attack these ships only had one particular target in mind, Kakashi said. In fact, it wasn't even a ship, it was a single person. The rest of the attacks were ordered to hide the orchestrator's real goal. It's like the person he wanted dead was a needle and he hid it among a haystack. In this case, the haystack is the other 103 murders. Who would kill 103 people just to hide the motives of a single murder? It seems a little extreme to me. Akiyama asked, clearly disturbed by the news. That doesn't matter right now, Suzuki said. We need to deal with these pirates now before they kill anyone else. We'll take care of that, Suzuki-san, Kakashi said. However, we'll expect the payment for a full B-rank mission to be sent to Konoha after our success. Suzuki looked at both of his partners, and they all agreed. He nodded in Kakashi's direction, letting him know that his request would be met. It was nearing evening, and Team 7 was perched in the trees, staring at the enemy encampment. Even though they had incapacitated several of the enemies in the previous battle, there were still many remaining. As they stealthily approached the camp, they got more and more confident. Their targets were drunk, and most of them were barely able to stand. The only exception was Suto, who looked very paranoid as if he were hiding from some kind of demon. When Team 7 attacked, it became utter chaos. The fight was even easier than the previous one. However, surprisingly, Suto had no interest in fighting and immediately fled. He had never run so fast in his life. Every once in a while he would look over his shoulder to make sure he wasn't being followed. Once he was a few miles away, he began to slow down. He wasn't a sensory type, but he was certain that he hadn't been followed. He needed to get out of this hellhole. Not because he was afraid of the Konoha team. Hitaki was strong, but not nearly terrifying enough to scare him. No, several of his high-ranking subordinates were going missing, and they all turned up dead. What was going on? And why had he been introduced to this nightmare? He didn't care about the money anymore. No amount of money was worth experiencing this fear. He landed in a clearing and finally allowed himself to have a break. His hands were gripping his knees tightly, and he was bent over, breathing as hard as he'd ever had before. However, he looked up and saw something that shocked him. About 10 feet in front of him stood a blond boy, likely no older than the children on Hitaki's team. He was wearing a loose-fitting, light blue kimono shirt that was tied with a thick dark brown Ono stylized belt. It was topped off with a pair of black Anbu-style pants with black shin-high sandals. What caught Suto's attention the most, however, was his face. It was beautiful, without a single mark or blemish. His blonde hair framed his face but didn't impair his vision. All in all, with the moonlight shining directly on him, he looked like some kind of angel. "Who the hell are you?" Suto asked, not particularly afraid of a 12-year-old boy. "I expected better from you, Suto-san," Naruto said in his typical, serene, tone of voice. "With all the money I paid you, I had hoped you'd last a little longer." Suto's eyes widened in shock. No way, this kid was the one who was paying them this whole time. He thought it was Gato. "Bullshit," Suto exclaimed. "No way a kid like you could get their hands on that kind of cash." Naruto didn't seem to register what the man said. He just maintained his relaxed posture and polite expression. "Will you help me once more, Suto-san?" the blond boy asked. "Will you give me a hand with something beautiful?" The missing nin from Kirigakure began to feel his body getting tired. His vision was getting blurry, and his knees were about to give out on him. "Genjutsu," he thought to himself as he collapsed to the ground. The boy hovered above him faster than he could even blink. The last thing he saw was the child's half-lidded gaze. Afterwards, he felt a mark of some sort being written on his forehead. Then he lost consciousness. Back in the office of the port officials, there was a rather large gathering of local authorities. The team of Konoha shinobi had left a few minutes ago. Suzuki was surprised at the way a team of 4 managed to manhandle roughly 40 armed pirates. The only issue now was that they were running out of places to put the charged criminals. However, the subject of today's meeting wasn't to discuss such small fry. No, kneeling before the 3 desks was the missing nin Suto Yuji. He had been found unconscious in the woods a few miles from his encampment. Apparently, he had cowardly retreated from the battle. "Suto-san," Suzuki said, "before you are sentenced to death, I must ask you, who is giving you the orders?" The rogue shinobi muttered something under his breath, which none of the occupants could hear. This trembling man was in stark contrast to what they had expected when they ordered him to be sent here. "Speak up, fool," Mai ordered, having little patience for this piece of trash. It was," Suto said, though the remainder of his response was unintelligible. One of the supervising officers placed his sword on Suto's neck and ordered him to speak up. It was," Suto finally was able to say. Monster." Everyone in the room raised their eyebrows at his statement. "A monster? How absurd. Do you really expect us to belie?" Mai began, but was cut off when she saw a glowing symbol appear on Suto's forehead. Nobody could make out what it was, but it was defiantly some form of kanji. However, before they could demand what was going on, something terrifying happened. Out of nowhere, hundreds of paper bombs began launching out of the symbol. They stuck to every inch of the room and even landed on the majority of occupants. Before anyone could vocalize their disbelief, the tags began to sizzle as if they had been set on fire. The last thing they saw was an intense flash of light before it was all over. The citizens of the port city were shocked at what they were seeing. The headquarters of the local government had just been blown sky high. The landscape shook as if there had been an earthquake. Even further away, in the nearby lake, the explosion could still be seen. Team 7 was shocked at what they had just saw. Even Kakashi, with his decades of experience, could hardly fathom what they just witnessed. They had just been in that building 20 minutes ago. As they continued on their way to Konoha, they had one thought in their minds. This was the craziest D-rank mission of all time.
That's all for now. If you enjoy this video, then please like, share and do comments.